Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I've been seeing a lot of chaos in the world lately, and honestly, my timeline has been pretty heavy. Between work stress, world events, and just the general exhaustion of daily life, I figured we could all use something different today. So I went digging through Reddit to find stories that might restore a little faith in humanity. These are the kind of posts that remind you there are still genuinely good people out there doing small things that make a big difference. I've got a collection of wholesome stories from people who experienced unexpected kindness. And before we start, you know the drill. Comment below what time you're watching this as well as which country you're watching from. Other than that, grab something cozy, settle in, and let's dive into some stories that might ease your worries and remind you that the world isn't completely broken. Our first story comes from someone who learned that kindness can show up in the most unexpected places. A stranger paid for my groceries when I was short on cash. I was having one of those weeks where everything seemed to go wrong. My car had broken down. I'd missed a day of work because of it, and I was stretching my last $20 until payday. I went to the grocery store to grab the absolute basics: milk, bread, and some pasta, just enough to get me through the next few days. When I got to the checkout, I realized I'd miscalculated. My total came to $23 and change, and I only had 20. The cashier was being patient, but there was a line forming behind me. I was trying to figure out what to put back when this older gentleman stepped up next to me. He had to be in his 70s, wearing a worn but clean jacket and a baseball cap. Without saying a word to me, he quietly handed the cashier his card and said, "We all need help sometimes." I started to protest, telling him I could just put something back, but he shook his head and smiled. "I've been where you are, son. Someone did this for me once when I needed it most." The cashier ran his card, and he helped me bag my groceries. As we walked toward the exit, I kept thanking him and asking for his address so I could pay him back. He introduced himself as George and told me he didn't want anything back. He said, "Just do something kind for someone else when you're able to." That's how it works. I asked him why he'd helped me, and he said he'd noticed me counting change twice before getting in line and remembered that feeling of worry. He told me he'd lost his job years ago when his factory closed, and a neighbour had bought groceries for his family for 2 weeks until he found new work. He said he'd been looking for ways to pay that forward ever since. George walked me to my car and helped me load everything in. Before he left, he said, "Things get better. They always do if you keep trying." I never saw him again, but I think about that interaction all the time. It wasn't just the money, though, that helped enormously. It was the dignity he gave me in that moment, the way he made it clear that needing help was nothing to be ashamed of. That was 3 years ago, and I've been financially stable for a while now. I keep $20 in my wallet specifically for moments like that, waiting for my chance to be someone's George. I've used it twice so far, and both times I've said exactly what he said to me. We all need help sometimes. That story hits different because George didn't just solve a problem, he preserved OP's dignity while doing it. The fact that he noticed the counting change and recognized that specific kind of worry shows he really understood what it felt like. And now OP is carrying on that tradition with the same $20 bill philosophy. Sometimes the most powerful kindness is the kind that acknowledges we've all been there. Moving on to our next story, this one's about the kind of neighbour we all wish we had. My neighbour brought me soup every day while I was sick. I live alone in a small apartment complex, and I've always been pretty independent. I'm polite to my neighbours, but we don't really hang out or anything. There's this woman named Julia who lives across the hall from me. She's probably in her 50s, works as a nurse, and always says hello when we pass in the hallway. Last month, I came down with the worst flu I've ever had. I'm talking fever, chills, couldn't keep food down, the whole nightmare. I called in sick to work thinking I'd be better in a day or two, but it just kept getting worse. By day 3, I was completely wiped out and hadn't eaten anything substantial since it started. That's when Julia knocked on my door. She was still in her scrubs from work and holding a thermos. She said she'd noticed I hadn't been leaving my apartment and heard me coughing through the walls. She'd brought homemade chicken soup and asked if I needed anything from the store. I was embarrassed because I probably looked terrible, but I was also grateful because I genuinely didn't have the energy to take care of myself. The soup was incredible, and for the first time in days, I was able to keep something down. I thanked her and figured that was a nice one-time gesture. But Julia came back the next day, and the day after that. For an entire week, she stopped by after her shifts with soup, crackers, tea, whatever she thought might help. She never stayed long because she knew I needed rest, but she always checked to make sure I was okay and asked if I needed medicine or groceries. On day 4, she brought me different soup and some of those electrolyte packets. She said she'd been watching my symptoms and thought I might be getting dehydrated. On day 6, she brought soup and orange juice and told me I was starting to look more human. By day 7, I was finally feeling well enough to shower and eat real food. When I tried to pay her back, or at least reimburse her for all the soup ingredients, she refused. She said she'd been sick and alone before, and knew how awful it was. She told me that when she'd had pneumonia a few years back, another neighbour had helped her out, and she'd been looking for ways to return that kindness ever since. Julia and I are actually friends now. We have coffee sometimes, and she's taught me how to make that soup recipe. She said she learned it from her grandmother, who always said soup was medicine for both the body and the soul. I've used that recipe twice now, when other friends have been sick, and I always tell them where it came from. The thing that gets me about Julia's kindness is how consistent it was. She didn't just bring soup once and call it good. She committed to checking on me every single day until she knew I was okay. And she did it after working long shifts as a nurse, when she was probably exhausted herself. Julia understood something important about being sick and alone, that it's not just about the physical symptoms. It's the isolation and the feeling like nobody would notice if something happened to you. She made sure OP knew someone was paying attention and someone cared whether they recovered. That's the kind of neighbour who restores your faith in community. Let's move on to something that'll probably make you smile. A little girl gave me a flower after seeing me cry. I was having, honestly, one of the worst days of my life. I'd just gotten some really bad news about my mum's health, and I was sitting in the park trying to process everything and figure out what to do next. I wasn't sobbing or anything dramatic, but tears were definitely happening, and I probably looked pretty rough. There was a family nearby with a little girl who looked maybe 5 or 6 years old. She was running around, picking dandelions and chasing butterflies, while her parents sat on a blanket having a picnic. I was trying to pull myself together because I didn't want to bring down their nice family afternoon. The little girl had been picking flowers in this patch of daisies, making a bouquet for her mum. I watched her for a while because she was so focused and serious about choosing the right flowers. She'd hold each one up to the light and examine it carefully before deciding whether it was good enough for her collection. After a few minutes, she walked over to where I was sitting. She had this small white daisy in her hand, and she held it out to me without saying anything at first. I was surprised and asked if that was for me. She nodded and said, "This is for you. You look sad." I took the flower and thanked her, and she said, "My mum says flowers make people feel better when they're sad. Do you feel better now?" I told her yes. I did feel a little better, and she smiled this huge smile and ran back to her parents. Her mum had been watching the whole interaction, and she came over to apologise in case her daughter had been bothering me. I told her it was the opposite of bothering, that her daughter had just made my mum said her whole day better. The daughter always noticed when people seemed upset, and that she'd been teaching her it was important to be kind to others. I kept that daisy until it completely dried up. I pressed it between the pages of a book, and I still have it. Whenever I'm having a tough day, I remember this little girl who saw a stranger crying and decided to do something about it. She didn't know what was wrong or whether it was any of her business. She just saw someone who needed kindness and offered what she had. The mum told me later that her daughter had asked if we could pray for the sad lady in the park. When I think about that interaction, I remember there are people raising kids who notice when others are hurting and who think it's their job to help. That gives me hope for the future. That story gets me because kids have this incredible ability to cut straight through social barriers and just respond to what they see. Adults might hesitate or wonder if it's appropriate to approach a crying stranger, but this little girl just saw someone who needed help and acted on it. The fact that her parents are raising her to notice and care about other people's pain is exactly the kind of thing that makes the world better. Our next story is about family pride and the power of showing up. My grandpa showed up to my college graduation in his old army uniform. I'm the first person in my family to graduate from college, and it was a huge deal for everyone. My parents were so proud they'd been talking about it for months, making plans and inviting relatives, but the person I most wanted to see there was my grandpa. Grandpa is 87 and has been my hero my entire life. He served in Korea and came back to work in factories for 40 years to support his family. He's always been quiet about his military service, never really talked about it much, but I knew it was an important part of who he was. The week before graduation, Grandpa had been in the hospital with pneumonia. He was doing better, but he was still weak, and the doctors weren't sure if he'd be able to travel. I told him not to worry about it, that I understood if he couldn't make it, but I could tell he was disappointed. Graduation day arrived, and my family was all sitting together in the auditorium. I kept looking for Grandpa, but didn't see him. My mum said he was still feeling weak and had decided to stay home and rest. I was sad but understood that his health came first. When they called my name to walk across the stage, I stood up and looked out at my family. That's when I saw him. Grandpa was sitting in the back row, and he was wearing his old army dress uniform. It was the first time I'd ever seen him in it, and it still fit him perfectly, despite his age. As I walked across the stage to get my diploma, I could see standing him up. When I reached the centre of the stage, he gave me a crisp military salute. The entire auditorium noticed, and people started clapping not just for me, but for him. Some people even stood up when they realised what was happening. After the ceremony, I found him and asked how he'd managed to get there, and why he'd worn his uniform. He said he'd felt better that morning and decided he wasn't going to miss his granddaughter's graduation for anything. As for the uniform, he said this was the most important day in our family's history, and he wanted to honour it properly. He told me he'd had that uniform dry cleaned and pressed for the first time in decades. He said when he put it on that morning, he felt like he was representing not just himself, but all the family members who'd worked hard jobs their whole lives so that someday their kids and grandkids could have opportunities they never had. The salute, he said, was his way of showing respect for what I'd accomplished. He said in the military, you salute to show honour and recognition, and he wanted everyone to know how proud he was. He said, I'd fought my own kind of battle to get through college, and I deserved that recognition. I still get emotional thinking about that moment. Grandpa passed away 2 months later, and I'm so grateful he made it to graduation. The image of him in that uniform, standing up and saluting me, is something I'll carry with me forever. It was his way of saying that all the hard work had been worth it, that the family's sacrifices had led to something meaningful. The power of that moment is incredible because Grandpa understood exactly what would make it special. He didn't just show up, he showed up in a way that honoured both his service and OP's achievement. That salute connected generations of family sacrifice and pride in one perfect gesture. The fact that he passed away so soon after makes his effort to be there even more meaningful. Let's move to our next story about unexpected honesty. A stranger found my lost wallet and mailed it back with $20 inside. I lost my wallet on the worst possible day. I was running late for a job interview, grabbed my stuff quickly, and somewhere between my apartment and the subway, my wallet fell out of my bag. I didn't realise it was gone until I was already at the interview and reached for my ID to check in with security. The interview was a disaster because I was stressed about the wallet situation and couldn't focus on the questions. I spent the whole time thinking about having to cancel credit cards, replace my license, and deal with all the paperwork. Plus, I'd had about $60 cash in there, which was basically my grocery money for the week. When I got home, I called the credit card companies and started the process of reporting everything stolen. I figured the wallet was gone forever, and whoever found it had probably just taken the cash and thrown the rest away. I'd resigned myself to spending the next week at the DMV and dealing with identity theft monitoring. 3 days later, I got a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was my wallet with everything exactly as I'd left it. All my cards were there, my license, even some random receipts I'd forgotten about. But here's the crazy part. There was now $80 in cash instead of the $60 I'd originally had. There was a handwritten note tucked behind my driver's license. It said, "Found this on the subway platform. I hope this helps cover the stress of losing it. The world needs more honest people, so I'm trying to be one. Hope your day gets better." It was signed a fellow New Yorker. I was completely stunned. Not only had this person gone through the trouble of mailing my wallet back, they'd added $20 of their own money. They'd also paid for postage and packaging, so they were out even more money just to do the right thing. I tried to figure out who it might have been. I asked around the subway station and checked with Lost and Found, but nobody knew anything. I posted on social media and local community boards, trying to find this person so I could thank them and pay them back, but I never got any responses. The note was written on lined paper in blue ink, very neat handwriting. Whoever it was had taken time to write something thoughtful instead of just dropping the wallet in the mail. The fact that they specifically mentioned trying to be an honest person made me think this was someone who'd maybe been in a similar situation before. I kept that note, and I've thought about it a lot over the past year. This person could have just mailed the wallet back empty and still would have been doing more than most people would. But they went above and beyond, adding money and a kind message to someone they'd never met and would never meet again. I've started carrying extra cash specifically for situations like this. If I ever find someone's lost wallet or phone, I want to be the kind of person who goes above and beyond to help. That stranger showed me what it looks like to not just do the right thing, but to do it with genuine kindness and generosity. The beautiful thing about this story is the stranger's note about trying to be an honest person. They weren't doing this for recognition or thanks. They were doing it because they'd decided that being honest meant going beyond just returning what wasn't theirs. Adding $20 and that encouraging note shows someone who understood that losing a wallet is stressful and wanted to actually make the situation better, not just fix it. Our next story comes from someone whose teacher saw potential when they couldn't see it themselves. My teacher wrote me a letter of encouragement that I still keep today. I was 15 and going through what felt like the worst year of my life. My parents were getting divorced, I was struggling in most of my classes, and I honestly didn't think I was good at anything. I'd started skipping school sometimes just because facing another day of failure felt impossible. Mr. Adams was my English teacher, and I was barely passing his class. I turned in assignments late, when I turned them in at all, and I was convinced he thought I was just another lazy student who didn't care. I'd sit in the back of his classroom, feeling invisible and worthless, counting down the minutes until I could leave. One Friday afternoon, Mr. Adams asked me to stay after class. I figured I was in trouble for something and prepared myself for another lecture about applying myself and reaching my potential. Instead, he handed me a sealed envelope with my name written on it in his careful handwriting. He told me to read it when I got home, and that he hoped it would help me understand something important about myself. I stuffed it in my backpack and didn't think about it much until I was doing homework that weekend. When I finally opened it, I wasn't prepared for what I found inside. The letter was 3 pages long, written in blue ink on his personal letterhead. He started by telling me that he'd been teaching for 22 years and had learned to recognize certain things in his students. He said he'd been watching me all semester and could see that I was carrying something heavy that was making it hard for me to focus on school. But then he wrote something that completely changed how I saw myself. He said that despite everything I was going through, my writing showed incredible depth and empathy. He pointed to specific essays I'd written and explained why they demonstrated real talent. He said I had a gift for understanding human nature and expressing complex emotions in ways that most adults couldn't manage. Mr. Adams wrote that he believed I had the potential to be a writer someday, if I wanted to be. He said my voice was authentic and powerful, and that the pain I was experiencing was actually making me a better writer, because it was teaching me to understand what other people go through. He told me that some of the greatest writers in history had struggled with similar challenges when they were young. The letter ended with him saying that he wanted me to know someone believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. He said he'd be there to help me, however he could, but that the most important thing was for me to not give up on myself. He wrote, "The world needs your voice, even if you don't know it yet." I cried reading that letter. It was the first time in months that someone had said anything positive about me or my future. I'd been so convinced that I was failing at everything that I'd stopped trying. But Mr. Adams had been paying attention, and he'd seen something in me that I couldn't see in myself. That letter changed everything for me. I started actually trying in his class and discovered that I really did love writing. Mr. Adams spent extra time helping me improve, and by the end of the year, my grades had turned around completely. More importantly, I'd started to believe that maybe I wasn't worthless after all. I'm 32 now, and I still have that letter. I've read it during every major challenge in my life, whenever I've doubted myself or felt like giving up. I became a journalist, and I've written stories that have helped people and made a difference in my community. None of that would have happened without Mr. Adams seeing something in me when I couldn't see it in myself. I tried to find Mr. Adams a few years ago to thank him, but learned that he'd passed away from cancer. I wrote a letter to his family, telling them how much he'd meant to me, and how that one letter had changed the entire direction of my life. His daughter wrote back and said he'd kept copies of letters he'd written to students over the years because he believed in the power of encouragement. That's the kind of teacher who changes lives. Not through grand gestures, but through really seeing their students and taking the time to tell them what they see. Mr. Adams didn't just teach English, he taught OP that they mattered and had something valuable to offer the world. The fact that he kept copies of his encouragement letters shows this wasn't a one-time thing. It was his mission to plant seeds of hope in kids who needed it most. Here's one about public transportation kindness that'll restore your faith in daily commuters. The bus driver waited for me on a rainy day when I was running late. I take the same bus to work every morning at exactly 7:45. It's usually pretty reliable, and I've gotten into a routine where I leave my apartment at 7:38, walk 3 blocks, and get to the stop just as the bus arrives. The timing works perfectly most days. Last Tuesday, it was pouring rain, the kind of downpour that soaks you completely in about 10 seconds. I'd overslept by about 5 minutes, which doesn't sound like much, but in my morning routine, that's the difference between catching my bus and being 20 minutes late for work. I grabbed my umbrella and ran through the rain as fast as I could. When I rounded the corner to my bus stop, I could see the bus was already there, with its doors closed. I was still half a block away, and passengers were already settling into their seats. I started running faster, waving my arm and shouting, even though I knew there was no way the driver could see me in the rain. The bus started to pull away from the stop, and my heart sank. I was going to be late for an important meeting, and I'd have to wait in the rain for the next bus. But then, something incredible happened. The bus stopped moving and the doors opened again. I ran up to the bus, completely soaked and out of breath. The driver, an older black man, with kind eyes and a gentle smile, looked at me and said, "I saw you running in my mirror. Figured you needed this bus more than I needed to be on time." He handed me some paper towels from his supply and told me to take a seat wherever I was comfortable. As I found an empty seat, still dripping wet and breathing heavily, I thanked him profusely. He just nodded and said, "We all have those mornings. Rain makes everything harder." So several other passengers smiled at me sympathetically, and one woman offered me more napkins from her purse. During the ride, I got to thinking about how easy it would have been for him to just stick to his schedule. Bus drivers have routes to maintain and timing to keep. He could have legitimately said he was already pulling away and couldn't stop. Instead, he made a choice to help someone he'd never met and would probably never see again. When we reached my stop, I thanked him again as I got off. He said, "Hope your day gets better from here," and gave me that same warm smile. I made it to work on time and had a successful meeting, but I kept thinking about his kindness throughout the day. I've been taking that same bus for 6 months now, and I've gotten to know the driver a little better. His name is Marcus, and he's been driving city buses for 12 years. He told me that he believes in treating people the way he'd want to be treated, especially when they're having a rough morning. Marcus has helped other passengers too. I've seen him wait for elderly people who move slowly, help parents with strollers, and always greet regular passengers with genuine warmth. He turns what could be just another impersonal city commute into something that feels more like a community. The thing that strikes me about that rainy morning is how Marcus saw me as a person, not just a passenger who'd missed his departure time. He understood that being caught in the rain and running late wasn't just inconvenient, it was stressful. His small act of kindness set the tone for my entire day and reminded me that there are people out there who still care about helping each other. Marcus proved that heroism doesn't require grand gestures. Sometimes it's just a bus driver who chooses compassion over punctuality. That split-second decision to reopen those doors and wait turned what could have been a terrible morning into a reminder that people still look out for each other. The fact that this is apparently just how Marcus operates, not a special exception, makes it even better. Let's move to a story that shows how animals can be our greatest protectors. My dog woke me up before a fire started and probably saved our lives. I adopted Luna 3 years ago from a shelter. She's a mixed breed, part German Shepherd and part something else we've never figured out. She's always been protective and alert, but I never realised just how much until last month. I'd had a long day at work and came home exhausted around 8 in the evening. I heated up some leftover pasta on the stove and ate dinner while watching TV. After eating, I cleaned up the kitchen and went to bed around 10:30. I thought I'd turned everything off properly, but apparently I'd left one of the burners on low heat under an empty pan. Around 2 in the morning, Luna started barking. Not her usual alert bark when she hears something outside, but this frantic, desperate barking that I'd never heard before. She was right next to my bed, pawing at my arm and whining between barks. At first, I told her to quiet down, thinking she'd heard a raccoon or something outside. But Luna wouldn't stop. She kept barking and pacing around my bedroom, then running toward the door and back to me. She was clearly trying to tell me something important. Finally, I got up to see what was wrong. The moment I opened my bedroom door, I smelled smoke. I followed Luna down the hallway toward the kitchen, and I could see a faint glow coming from that direction. When I rounded the corner, I saw flames starting to spread from the stove area to the wooden cabinets above it. The pan I'd left on the burner had overheated and caught fire, and it was beginning to spread to other parts of the kitchen. I immediately called the fire department while trying to turn off the stove and contain the fire with my extinguisher. The flames were spreading faster than I could control them, so I grabbed Luna and some important documents and got out of the house. The fire department arrived within 6 minutes and were able to save most of the house, but the kitchen was completely destroyed. The fire chief told me that if the fire had burned for another 15 or 20 minutes before being discovered, it probably would have spread throughout the entire house. He said house fires at night are especially dangerous because people don't usually wake up until it's too late. He asked how I'd known to check the kitchen, and I explained about Luna's barking. The fire investigator confirmed that the pan on the stove had been the cause. He said it was exactly the kind of accident that happens when people are tired and distracted. He told me that Luna had essentially saved both of our lives by alerting me when the fire was still small enough to escape from safely. During the 2 months it took to renovate my kitchen, Luna stayed close to me constantly. It was like she understood how serious the situation had been and wanted to make sure I was safe. Even now, months later, she still does a little patrol of the house before we go to bed each night, checking all the rooms like she's making sure everything is secure. I've always loved Luna, but that night gave me a whole new appreciation for the bond between dogs and their humans. She didn't just wake me up because she was scared, she specifically came to get me and led me to the problem. She understood that I needed to know what was happening, and she didn't give up until I followed her. People talk about dogs being man's best friend, but Luna proved that night that she's more than a companion. She's my guardian, my protector, and the reason I'm still alive. I make sure to give her extra treats and belly rubs every day, though I know she didn't save me for rewards. She did it because that's what family does for each other. Luna's story is incredible because she didn't just alert OP to danger, she refused to give up until they understood what was happening. That kind of persistence and intelligence shows the deep connection dogs form with their humans. The fact that she still does security patrols before bed shows she takes her protective role seriously. Sometimes, our pets understand our needs better than we do ourselves. Moving on to our next story about the kindness of strangers in difficult moments. A stranger helped me fix my car and refused any money for his help. My car broke down on one of the worst nights possible. It was pouring rain, I was 40 minutes from home, and it was nearly 11 at night. I'd been driving back from visiting my sick grandmother when my engine started making terrible noises and then just died completely in the middle of nowhere. I pulled over to the side of a rural highway with no streetlights and very little traffic. My phone had barely any signal, and I was getting soaked every time I stepped out of the car to try to figure out what was wrong. I knew nothing about car engines, and even with my phone's flashlight, I couldn't tell what the problem might be. I was starting to panic because it was getting late. The rain was getting heavier, and I was genuinely worried about being stranded out there alone. I'd called for roadside assistance, but they said it would be at least 2 hours before anyone could get to my location. I was cold, wet, and honestly a little scared. That's when I saw headlights approaching from behind me. A pickup truck pulled over, and a man got out wearing a rain jacket and baseball cap. He looked to be in his 50s, and he walked up to my window and asked if I needed help. I was hesitant at first because it was late and I was alone, but something about his demeanour seemed genuinely kind. He introduced himself as Jack and said he lived about 10 miles down the road. He'd seen my hazard lights and figured someone might be in trouble. I explained what had happened with my engine, and he asked if he could take a look. I popped the hood, and Jack spent about 10 minutes examining things with a proper flashlight. Jack told me it looked like a problem with my alternator belt, which had snapped completely. He said it was actually a fairly simple fix if you had the right tools, and a replacement. Good news was that he built the had both in his truck because he'd helped other stranded drivers before and liked to be prepared. For the next hour, Jack worked on my car in the pouring rain. He crawled under the engine, got his clothes completely soaked, and patiently explained what he was doing as he worked. He said he'd learned basic car repair from his father and had always believed in helping people when they were stuck. When Jack finished, my car started right up. I was so relieved I almost cried. I pulled out my wallet to pay him for the part and his time, but he absolutely refused to take any money. He said he was just glad he could help and that someone had done the same thing for his daughter when she'd broken down a few years ago. Jack followed me for about 20 miles to make sure the up properly repair was holding before flashing his lights and turning off toward his house. I never got his last name or contact information, but I'll never forget how he stopped on a terrible night to help a stranger who desperately needed it. The next day I went to an auto parts store and bought a roadside emergency kit with tools and basic replacement parts. I figured that if I'm ever in Jack's position, maybe I can help someone else the way he helped me. I've already used it twice to assist other drivers, and each time I think about Jack and how one person's kindness can inspire others to do the same. Jack's willingness to spend an hour in the rain fixing a stranger's car shows the best of human nature. He didn't just offer help, he came prepared with tools because he had made helping stranded drivers a regular part of how he moved through the world. The fact that he refused payment and that his actions were inspired by someone helping his daughter creates this beautiful cycle of kindness that keeps spreading. Here's one that shows how small daily gestures can become the brightest part of someone's routine. My friend brought me coffee every morning during finals. I was in the middle of what felt like the most stressful 2 weeks of my college career. Finals were hitting hard, I was pulling all-nighters in the library, and I was basically surviving on energy drinks and whatever snacks I could grab from vending machines. My friend Rachel worked at the coffee shop on campus, and she'd always get there early for her opening shifts. I'd been camping out at the library since it opened at 6 in the morning, trying to squeeze in as much study time as possible before my exams. The library was only about a 5-minute walk from the coffee shop, but I was so focused on studying that I kept forgetting to eat or get proper caffeine. About 3 days into finals week, Rachel showed up at my usual table in the library with a large coffee and a blueberry muffin. I was surprised to see her and asked what she was doing there so early. She said she'd seen me through the window on her way to work and figured I probably needed fuel more than sleep at that point. I tried to pay her for the coffee, but she waved me off and said she got free drinks during her shifts anyway. She told me she'd noticed I'd been looking pretty rough lately and wanted to make sure I was taking care of myself. The coffee was perfect, exactly how I liked it, with oat milk and an extra shot, and the muffin was still warm. The next morning, Rachel showed up again. Same routine, coffee and something to eat, right around 6:30 when she was walking to work. When I thanked her and tried to insist on paying, she said, "If I'm already going that way, I might as well bring you one too. Besides, you look like you're about to fall over." This became our daily routine for the rest of finals week. Every morning, Rachel would stop by the library on her way to open the coffee shop. She'd bring me coffee, some kind of pastry or breakfast sandwich, and usually spend a few minutes asking how I was holding up. She'd check if I'd gotten any sleep, remind me to eat lunch, and tell me I was going to do great on my exams. On the morning of my hardest exam, calculus, Rachel showed up with my usual coffee, but also with a note written on a napkin. It said, "You've got this. I believe in you. Now go show that test who's boss." She'd drawn a little smiley face and signed it with her name. I kept that napkin in my backpack through the entire exam. I ended up doing well on all my finals, better than I'd expected considering how stressed I'd been. When I thanked Rachel afterward and told her how much her daily coffee runs had meant to me, she said she remembered how overwhelming finals could be and just wanted to help however she could. Rachel said she'd been in my position before, stressed and forgetting to take care of basic needs, and someone had helped her get through it. She said bringing me coffee wasn't a big deal for her, but she hoped it made the whole experience a little easier. She was right. Those few minutes of kindness each morning became the thing I looked forward to during one of the most stressful times of my academic life. That story hits me because Rachel understood that sometimes the best support isn't grand gestures, it's just showing up consistently when someone needs you. She turned her daily walk to work into a mission to make sure OP was taken care of. The note on the napkin shows she wasn't just bringing coffee out of habit, she was genuinely invested in OP's success. Let's move to a story about grace under pressure and unexpected kindness from a complete stranger. A waitress covered my meal when I forgot my wallet. I was having lunch at this small diner near my office, the kind of place where the coffee's always fresh, and the waitstaff knows your order after you've been there twice. I'd been going there pretty regularly for about 6 months, usually ordering the same turkey sandwich and soup combo. That particular day had been absolutely chaotic at work. I'd been running between meetings, dealing with a crisis that had blown up overnight, and barely had time to grab lunch before my next appointment. I rushed out of the office without really thinking, just grateful to have 30 minutes to sit down and eat something real. I ordered my usual and spent most of the meal answering emails on my phone, trying to stay on top of the work situation. The food was great as always, and for the first time that day, I felt like I could actually breathe. When I finished eating, I reached for my wallet to pay the check. My wallet wasn't there. I checked every pocket, my purse, everywhere I could think of. I realised I'd left it sitting on my desk when I grabbed my phone and keys to rush out. I started panicking because I had no way to pay for my meal, no cash, no cards, nothing. The waitress, Emma, had been working there for years and always remembered how I liked my coffee. When she brought the check and saw me frantically searching through my bag, she asked if everything was okay. I explained the situation, feeling mortified, and asking if I could leave my phone as collateral while I ran back to get my wallet. Emma looked at me for a second, then smiled and said, "Don't worry about it. I've got you today." I know she took the check and walked away before I could protest. I sat there stunned, trying to process what had just happened. When she came back, I started explaining that I could be back in 20 minutes with money, but she shook her head. She said she'd been in similar situations before and knew how stressful it was. She told me that someone had covered her meal once when she was short on cash, and she'd always remembered how grateful she'd felt. She said paying it forward was just part of how she tried to move through the world. I asked Emma for her contact information so I could pay her back, but she refused to give it to me. She said the only thing she wanted was for me to do something kind for someone else. When I had the chance, she winked and said, "That's how these things work best, just passing kindness along when you can." The next day I came back with money to pay for both meals, mine from yesterday and whatever I ordered that day. Emma laughed and accepted payment for my new meal, but refused to take anything for the previous day. She said a deal was a deal, and I should just focus on being kind to other people. I've been going to that diner for 3 years now, and Emma and I have become genuinely friendly. I've seen her cover meals for other customers who are short on cash, help elderly patrons with heavy doors, and remember personal details about regulars' families. She treats everyone who walks through those doors like they matter. That experience taught me something important about how grace works in everyday life. Emma didn't make a big deal out of helping me. She just quietly solved my problem and turned it into a lesson about paying kindness forward. She understood that being embarrassed about forgetting my wallet was punishment enough, and she chose to make the situation better instead of worse. Emma's kindness in that moment was perfect because she didn't make OP feel guilty or indebted. She just fixed the problem and asked for kindness to be passed along. That's the mark of someone who genuinely understands how to help people with dignity intact. The fact that this is apparently just how Emma operates makes it even better. Here's our next story about the power of inclusion and learning something new for someone you care about. My brother learned sign language for my best friend. My best friend Kyle has been deaf since birth, and we've been close since elementary school. Most people in our friend group and family have learned basic signs over the years, enough to include Kyle in conversations and make him feel welcome. But my brother Ethan had always been shy about trying to learn, worried he'd mess up or look foolish. Kyle and I have been friends for so long that I sometimes forget not everyone knows how to communicate with him. When we're hanging out, I automatically translate for people who don't sign, and Kyle is incredibly patient with people who are trying to learn. He's always encouraging when someone attempts to sign, even if they're making mistakes. Last year, I started dating someone seriously, and I wanted to introduce Kyle to my boyfriend's family. I was nervous about how the meeting would go because not everyone is comfortable around deaf people, and I wanted Kyle to feel included and welcomed. I'd explained the situation to my boyfriend, and he'd been great about learning some basic signs. The dinner was planned for a Sunday at my parents' house, and I'd invited Kyle to join us. My brother Ethan was going to be there too, along with my boyfriend's parents and siblings. I'd given everyone a heads up about Kyle being deaf, and most people seemed fine with it, though I could tell some were a bit nervous about the communication aspect. When we all sat down for dinner, I was doing my usual thing of translating conversations so Kyle could follow along. Everyone was being polite, but I could feel that slightly awkward energy that sometimes happens when people don't know how to interact naturally with someone who's deaf. Kyle was being his usual gracious self, smiling and nodding along. Then Ethan, who had been quiet for most of the meal, turned directly to Kyle and signed, "Nice to meet you. I'm Ethan, Sarah's brother." Kyle's face lit up with this huge smile, and he signed back, "Nice to meet you too. Thank you for learning to talk with me." The whole table went quiet because they realised what had just happened. I was completely shocked because Ethan had never shown interest in learning sign language before. When I asked him later how he'd learned to sign, he told me he'd been taking online classes for the past 3 months. He said he'd realised that Kyle was important to me, and he wanted to be able to communicate with him directly, instead of always going through me. Ethan explained that he'd been embarrassed about not knowing how to sign when Kyle had been part of our lives for so many years. He said he'd started learning after watching Kyle always have to wait for translations during family gatherings, and he'd decided that wasn't fair. He wanted Kyle to feel like he belonged with our family, not like he was a guest who needed special accommodations. Throughout the rest of the dinner, Ethan made an effort to include Kyle directly in conversations. His signing wasn't perfect, and sometimes he had to fingerspell words he didn't know, but Kyle was thrilled to have someone new to communicate with. They ended up having a great conversation about sports and shared interests. After dinner, Kyle pulled me aside and told me how much it meant to him that Ethan had learned to sign. He said most hearing people never make that effort, and it showed him that I had a family who really cared about including him. He said he'd never felt more welcomed in someone's home than he did that evening. Ethan has continued improving his signing skills, and now he and Kyle have their own friendship that doesn't require me to translate. They text each other, hang out sometimes, and Kyle has even taught Ethan some more advanced signs. What started as my brother wanting to be polite has turned into a genuine friendship between them. That dinner changed the whole dynamic of our friend group because other people saw Ethan's effort and started learning basic signs too. Kyle went from being someone who needed accommodations to just being another member of our extended family. All because my brother decided that real inclusion meant learning to communicate directly. Ethan's commitment to learning sign language shows what genuine inclusion looks like. He didn't just learn a few polite phrases, he put in months of work because he recognized that Kyle deserved to be fully part of the family, not always on the outside waiting for translations. The fact that it led to their own friendship makes the whole thing even more beautiful. Moving on to a story about neighbours who prove that community still exists in small, powerful ways. A neighbour mowed my lawn after my surgery. I had to have knee surgery last spring. Pretty major reconstruction that left me on crutches for 6 weeks and limited mobility for months after that. I live in a small house with a decent-sized yard that I normally take care of myself. I've always been pretty independent and take pride in keeping my property looking neat. The surgery was scheduled for early April, right when grass starts growing again after winter. I knew I wouldn't be able to mow for months, and I was stressing about how overgrown everything was going to get. I looked into hiring a lawn service, but it was way out of my budget, especially with all the medical bills I was facing. My neighbour Liam lives 2 houses down from me. We've always been friendly, the kind of neighbours who wave when we see each other and maybe chat about the weather if we're both outside. He's probably in his early 40s, married with a couple of young kids, and I always see him working in his own ends. The yard on first week after my surgery, I was pretty much stuck inside recovering. I could barely get around on my crutches, and even simple tasks were exhausting. I'd look out my window at my yard and watch the grass getting longer every day. It was driving me crazy because I'm not the kind of person who lets things go, but there was literally nothing I could do about it. On Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of a lawn mower running. At first I figured it was just Liam working on his own yard like he always did on weekends. But the sound seemed to be going on longer than usual, and it sounded like it was coming from different directions around my house. I hobbled to my front window on my crutches and looked outside. Liam was mowing my front lawn with his own mower, making neat rows just like I always did. His wife was pulling weeds from my flower beds, and their kids were picking up sticks and debris from the yard. They were all working together to take care of my property, like it was their own. I opened my front door and called out to thank them, asking what I owed them for their time. Liam just waved and said, "Don't worry about it, we're just helping out a neighbour." When I insisted that I needed to pay them something, his wife said they were happy to help and that I'd do the same thing for them if the situation were reversed. For the next 8 weeks, while I was recovering, Liam mowed my lawn every Saturday morning. He never asked if I needed it done, never made a big deal about it, just quietly took care of it, along with his own yard work. Sometimes his kids would help, and I'd watch from my window as he taught them how to edge around flower beds and clean up afterward. When I was finally cleared to do light yard work again, I went over to thank Liam properly and ask what I could do to repay him. He said seeing my yard back to normal was thanks enough, and that he'd actually enjoyed having a bigger space to work on. He told me he'd grown up in a neighbourhood where people looked out for each other, and he wanted his kids to learn that same sense of community. Liam said he'd noticed that I always kept my yard neat and figured it was probably bothering me to watch it get overgrown. He was right, it had been driving me crazy, but more than just maintaining my property, his help had given me one less thing to worry about during a really difficult time when everything felt overwhelming. I've been fully recovered for months now, and Liam and I have become genuine friends instead of just polite neighbours. When his family went out of town last month, I watered their plants and brought in their mail. It's become the kind of neighbourly relationship where we actually look out for each other, and it all started with him quietly mowing my grass when I couldn't do it myself. Liam's approach to helping was perfect because he didn't make OP feel helpless or indebted. He just saw a problem and fixed it, week after week, without drama or expectations. The fact that he involved his kids and used it as a teaching moment about community makes it even better. Sometimes being a good neighbour means doing things people don't ask for, but desperately need. Let's move to a story about the lasting power of handwritten words in our digital world. My dad sent me a handwritten letter every month in college. When I left for college, I was excited about the independence and freedom, but I was also nervous about being so far from home for the first time. My dad had always been the steady, supportive presence in my life, and I wondered how I'd handle big decisions and tough times without being able to talk to him face to face. During my first week on campus, I was homesick and overwhelmed by everything. New classes, new people, figuring out how to do laundry and manage my time. I called home pretty regularly those first few weeks, just to hear familiar voices and get advice about navigating college life. My parents were great about staying in touch and being supportive from a distance. About a month into the semester, I got my first piece of mail that wasn't a bill or campus newsletter. It was a thick envelope with my name written in my dad's careful handwriting. Inside was a 3-page letter written on his personal stationery, the kind with his name printed at the top that he used for important correspondence. The letter wasn't about anything earth-shattering, just Dad sharing what was happening at home, asking about my classes, and telling me how proud he was that I was doing so well adjusting to college life. But what struck me was how thoughtful and deliberate it was. Every sentence seemed carefully considered, and he shared stories and advice in a way that felt different from our phone conversations. Dad wrote about things I'd probably forgotten we'd talked about, checking in on how specific situations had turned out. He remembered that I'd been nervous about my chemistry lab and asked how it was going. He mentioned a book he thought I'd enjoy and said he was mailing a copy separately. He told me about changes happening in our neighbourhood and family updates I'd want to know about. At the end of the letter, Dad wrote that he knew email and texting were easier, but that handwritten letters felt more personal to him. He said when he was writing by hand, he had time to really think about what he wanted to say, and he hoped I'd feel the connection, even though we were far apart. He signed it "Love Dad" in the same handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards my whole life. A month later, another letter arrived. This became Dad's routine throughout my 4 years of college. Every single month, without fail, I'd get a handwritten letter from him. Sometimes they were long and detailed, sometimes shorter if he'd been busy, but they always came. He never missed a month, even when he was travelling for work or dealing with family emergencies. The letters covered everything from major life advice to silly stories about our dog's latest antics. Dad wrote about books he was reading, movies he'd seen, things happening in politics that he knew I'd have opinions about. He'd ask about my roommates, my professors, whether I was eating well and getting enough sleep. He remembered details from previous letters and followed up on things I'd mentioned. During tough times, like when I was struggling with a particularly difficult class or dealing with friendship drama, Dad's letters became lifelines. He had a way of putting problems in perspective without minimizing how I was feeling. He'd share stories from his own college experience or offer practical advice, but always in this gentle, supportive way that made me feel less alone. The letters also became a record of my college years, in a way that phone calls and texts never could have. Things that been. Dad would reference had happened months earlier, creating this ongoing narrative of my growth and experiences. Reading back through them now, I can see how I changed and developed during those 4 years. When I graduated, Dad gave me a wooden box he'd made to store all the letters. He said he'd been saving copies of everything he'd written, and he wanted me to have both sets so I could remember not just what was happening in my life, but how much he'd been thinking about me throughout college. The box is now completely full with 48 letters, one for every month I was away. I still have every single letter, and I reread them sometimes when I'm facing big decisions or just missing home. There's something about Dad's handwriting and the deliberate thoughtfulness of those letters that emails could never replicate. In a world of instant communication, he chose the slowest method because he knew it would mean the most. The dedication of writing a letter every month for 4 years shows incredible commitment to maintaining connection. OP's dad understood that handwritten letters create a different kind of intimacy than digital communication. The fact that he kept copies and gave OP a handmade box shows this wasn't just about staying in touch, it was about creating a lasting record of love and support. Here's a story about workplace kindness and the courage to look out for each other's safety. My co-worker walked me home when the streets felt unsafe. I work late shifts at a restaurant downtown, and I usually get off around 11 at night. Most of the time, I take the bus home, but sometimes when service is running behind or the weather's bad, I end up walking the 12 blocks to my apartment. It's not the worst neighbourhood, but it's not great either, especially late at night. For a few weeks in the fall, there had been some incidents in the area around our restaurant. Nothing that happened to anyone I knew personally, but enough stories about people getting mugged or harassed that I was starting to feel nervous about walking alone after work. I'd started carrying my keys between my fingers and staying on well-lit streets, but I was still anxious every time I had to make that walk. My co-worker Hannah had noticed that I seemed stressed about getting home after our shifts. She'd ask if I was okay when I'd check my phone for bus times, or when I'd hesitate before leaving the restaurant. I'd mentioned the safety concerns casually, not wanting to make a big deal about it, but she'd picked up on my worry. One night when the last bus had already stopped running and I was facing the walk home alone, Hannah asked where I lived. When I told her the general area, she said she lived in the opposite direction, but offered to walk with me anyway. I told her that was really sweet but unnecessary, that I didn't want her to go out of her way and have to walk back alone. Hannah insisted it was no problem and said she'd rather know I got home safely than worry about me walking by myself. She said she'd been in similar situations and knew how scary it could feel. We walked together that night, and she kept the conversation light and normal, not making me feel like I was being overly cautious or paranoid about the safety issues. When we got to my building, Hannah waited until I was inside and waved from the sidewalk. I offered to call her a ride share, or at least give her money for a taxi back to her place, but she said she'd be fine and that the walk would be good exercise. I felt bad about her having to make the extra trip, but I also felt incredibly grateful to have a co-worker who cared about my well-being. The next week, Hannah offered to walk with me again when I was facing another late-night walk home. I realised this was becoming a pattern and told her I couldn't keep letting her go so far out of her way. She said it honestly wasn't a big deal and that she'd want someone to do the same thing for her daughter someday. Hannah explained that she'd grown up in a rough neighbourhood and remembered what it felt like to be scared walking alone at night. She said women needed to look out for each other, and walking a few extra blocks was a small thing she could do to help a friend feel safer. She told me that feeling scared shouldn't be something I just had to accept as part of working late shifts. For about 6 weeks, Hannah walked me home whenever I couldn't catch the bus. She never made me feel guilty about it or like I owed her anything, Sometimes we talk about work or our lives, sometimes we just walk quietly together. But every time, I felt so much more relaxed knowing I wasn't making that trip alone. Eventually, I was able to work out a more reliable transportation situation that didn't involve walking late at night. But Hannah's willingness to help during those weeks when I felt vulnerable meant everything to me. She turned what had been a source of anxiety into something manageable, and she did it without making me feel weak or helpless. I've tried to pay that kindness forward by offering help to other co-workers who've been in similar situations. Hannah taught me that sometimes being a good friend means recognizing when someone needs support and offering it, even when they're too proud or embarrassed to ask directly. She saw a problem and quietly solved it, no questions asked. Hannah's willingness to walk miles out of her way night after night shows what real solidarity looks like. She understood that feeling unsafe shouldn't just be something women have to endure, and she acted on that belief consistently. The fact that she connected it to wanting someone to do the same for her own daughter shows she was thinking about building the kind of world she wanted for the next generation. Here's our next story about unexpected generosity during tough times. My friend's mum bought me school supplies when I couldn't afford them. I was starting my junior year of high school, and money was really tight at home. My mum was working 2 jobs after my dad lost his position at the plant, and we were basically living paycheck to paycheck. School supply lists had gotten so expensive, and I was stressed about not having the right notebooks and materials for my classes. I'd been friends with Katie since middle school, and we spent a lot of time at each other's houses. Her mum, Mrs. Rodriguez, was always really kind to me and treated me like I was one of her own kids. She'd make extra snacks when I was over, and always asked about how school was going and whether I needed help with homework. The week before school started, Katie and I went shopping for supplies together. Her mum drove us to the big box store and gave Katie a list and some cash to get everything she needed. I tagged along mostly just to hang out, but I was also trying to figure out what I absolutely had to have versus what I could do without. While Katie was loading up her carts with fresh notebooks, fancy pens, and all the supplies on her list, I was doing mental math trying to figure out if I could make do with last year's beat-up binders and whatever pens I could find around the house. I was trying to be casual about it, but Mrs. Rodriguez noticed I wasn't picking up anything for myself. She asked me quietly if I'd gotten my school supplies yet, and I made some excuse about planning to shop later with my mum. She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't buying it. When Katie went to look at backpacks, Mrs. Rodriguez pulled me aside and asked directly if everything was okay at home financially. I was embarrassed but ended up telling her the truth. I explained that money was really tight and that my mum was stressed about all the back-to-school expenses. Mrs. Rodriguez listened without judgment and then said something I'll never forget. She told me, "You're family too, and family helps each other." Before I could protest, Mrs. Rodriguez had grabbed a shopping cart and was walking through the store picking up everything on my supply list. She got me notebooks, pens, highlighters, folders, everything I needed for the year. When I tried to stop her or promised to pay her back, she shook her head and said this wasn't a loan, it was a gift. At checkout, she paid for Katie's supplies and mine without making any big deal about it. She handed me my bags and said she hoped I had a great school year. In the car ride home, she made me promise not to be embarrassed about accepting help when I needed it. Mrs. Rodriguez told me that when she was my age, her family had struggled financially too. She said a neighbour had helped her get school clothes one year, and she'd never forgotten how much that kindness had meant. She said she'd been looking for ways to pay that forward, and helping me felt like the right opportunity. That gesture completely changed my junior year. Instead of worrying about not having the right materials or feeling embarrassed about my old supplies, I could focus on my classes and actually enjoy school. I ended up having one of my best academic years, partly because I wasn't stressed about basic necessities. I kept in touch with Mrs. Rodriguez even after Katie and I grew apart in college. She always remembered my birthday and would ask about my studies and career. When I got my first job after graduation, I sent her a thank you card telling her how much her support had meant during high school. Years later, when I was financially stable, I started sponsoring school supplies for kids whose families couldn't afford them. Every August, I think about Mrs. Rodriguez and how she taught me that sometimes family isn't just about blood relations. It's about people who see you struggling and choose to help without making you feel small about needing assistance. That story ends there. Mrs. Rodriguez understood that being a teenager without the right school supplies isn't just about materials. It's about dignity and belonging. The way she handled it privately and called OP family shows, she knew exactly how to help without causing embarrassment. Some people have this gift for making generosity feel natural instead of like charity. Moving on to a story about small acts of kindness during travel anxiety, a stranger on a plane gave me headphones. I have terrible flight anxiety, and this particular flight was a red-eye from Los Angeles to Boston that I absolutely dreaded taking. I'd booked it because it was the only affordable option, but I'd been stressed about it for weeks. Long flights in the dark just make my anxiety so much worse. I got to my seat and was already feeling that familiar panic starting to build. My hands were sweaty, my heart was racing, and I was doing those breathing exercises that never seem to work when you actually need them. I'd brought a book and downloaded some music to my phone, but I realised I'd forgotten to pack headphones in my carry-on bag. The flight attendant was going through safety demonstrations, and all I could think about was how I was going to survive 6 hours of engine noise and other passengers without being able to listen to music or watch something to distract myself. I was seriously considering buying overpriced headphones from the airline, even though I couldn't really afford them. The guy sitting next to me was probably in his 30s, wearing a business suit and working on his laptop. He seemed completely comfortable with flying, the kind of person who probably travels all the time for work. I was trying not to be obvious about my anxiety, but I was fidgeting constantly and probably not hiding it very well. As we were taxiing for takeoff, he noticed me gripping the armrests and asked if I was okay. I admitted I was nervous about flying and mentioned that I'd forgotten headphones, which was making everything worse. He listened sympathetically and said he understood because he used to have flight anxiety too. That's when he reached into his carry-on bag and pulled out a brand new pair of noise-cancelling headphones still in their packaging. He handed them to me and said, "These might help. Music makes it easier." I started to protest that I couldn't accept such an expensive gift from a stranger, but he insisted. He introduced himself as Lucas and explained that he travelled constantly for work and always carried backup headphones in case his primary pair broke. He said he'd rather know I was comfortable than have them sitting unused in his bag. He helped me connect them to my phone and suggested some calming playlists. The headphones were incredible. They blocked out most of the engine noise and made the whole flight feel so much more manageable. I was able to listen to music, watch movies, and actually relax for the first time on an airplane in years. Lucas checked on me a few times during the flight to make sure everything was working okay. When we landed in Boston, I tried to give the headphones back to Lucas, but he refused to take them. He said he had plenty of others and wanted me to keep them for future flights. He told me that someone had helped him through his first panic attack on a plane years ago, and he'd been looking for opportunities to help other anxious travellers ever since. Lucas gave me his business card and told me to email him if I ever needed advice about managing flight anxiety. He said he'd learned lots of techniques over the years and was happy to share what worked for him. We ended up corresponding a few times, and his tips really helped me become a more confident traveller. I still use those headphones every time I fly, and they've completely changed my relationship with air travel. What used to be something I dreaded has become manageable, even relaxing sometimes. I keep Lucas's business card in my wallet as a reminder that strangers can show up in your life exactly when you need them most. Last month, I was on a flight and noticed a teenage girl who seemed really anxious during takeoff. I remembered Lucas's kindness and offered her some breathing exercises I'd learned. She told me later it had really helped, and I realised I'd become the person who helps other nervous flyers. That's how kindness spreads, from one stranger to the next. Lucas perfectly understood that anxiety isn't rational, and that sometimes the solution isn't advice or reassurance, but practical tools that actually work. Those headphones weren't just about blocking noise, they were about giving OP control over their environment when everything felt overwhelming. The fact that he'd experienced flight anxiety himself made his help feel genuine instead of dismissive. Let's move to a story about preserving family traditions and the bonds they create. My grandma taught me to bake her secret recipe. My grandmother was the kind of cook who never used measuring cups and could make incredible meals just by tasting and adjusting as she went along. Her kitchen always smelled like something amazing was in the oven, and family gatherings revolved around whatever she'd spent the day preparing. Her most famous creation was these apple cinnamon rolls that were absolutely legendary in our family. They were different from any cinnamon rolls I'd ever tasted, with this perfect balance of sweet and spicy that made everyone ask for the recipe. But Grandma had never written it down anywhere, and she'd always just smile and say it was a family secret. When I was 16, I started spending more time at Grandma's house after school. My parents both worked late, and she lived close to my high school, so it became natural for me to stop by her place before going home. She'd always have a snack ready and would ask about my day while puttering around her kitchen. During one of these after-school visits, Grandma announced that she was going to teach me how to make her famous cinnamon rolls. She said she'd been thinking about how none of us grandkids really knew how to cook her recipes, and she wanted to make sure at least one person could carry on the tradition. We spent that entire afternoon in her kitchen, and I learned that her secret was actually about a dozen little techniques that she'd perfected over decades. The way she kneaded the dough, the specific spices she mixed into the filling, the temperature she baked them at, even the way she arranged them in the pan made a difference. Grandma made me write everything down in a notebook, but she also insisted I learn to do it by feel the way she did. She'd guide my hands while I kneaded dough and have me taste the filling mixture until I could recognize when the proportions were right. She said baking was as much about intuition as it was about following directions. The most important part, she told me, wasn't actually the ingredients or techniques. It was the love and intention you put into the baking. She said food made with care for people you love always tastes better, and that was the real secret to all her recipes. Over the next few months, Grandma and I had regular baking sessions where she taught me her other specialties. We made her chocolate chip cookies, her famous pot roast, and her holiday sugar cookies that were shaped like little angels. Each recipe came with stories about who had taught it to her or when she'd first made it for our family. During our last baking session together, Grandma pulled me close and whispered, "Now it's yours to pass down someday." She said she felt peaceful knowing that her recipes would continue in the family even after she was gone. She made me promise to teach them to my own children or grandchildren when the time came. Grandma passed away 2 years later, but I'd had enough practice that I could make her cinnamon rolls perfectly. At her funeral, I brought 3 dozen of them for the reception, and everyone said they tasted exactly like hers. People were crying and laughing at the same time, sharing memories of her cooking while eating rolls that connected them to her one more time. I'm 28 now, and I still make Grandma's cinnamon rolls for every family gathering. The recipe has become my contribution to holidays and special occasions, and people always comment that they taste just like they remember from her kitchen. It's my way of keeping her presence alive in our family traditions. Recently, my teenage cousin asked me to teach her how to make them. As I guided her hands through kneading the dough and watched her face light up when she tasted the filling, I heard myself saying the same things Grandma had said to me. The tradition is continuing exactly like she hoped it would, passed down with the same love and intention she'd put into teaching me. That story ends there. There's something magical about how Grandma didn't just teach a recipe, she passed down the philosophy behind it. The idea that food made with love tastes different isn't just sentimental, it's about the intention and care that goes into every step. The fact that OP is now teaching their cousin shows how these traditions create lasting bonds across generations. Moving on to our next story, about finding sanctuary in unexpected places. The librarian saved me a seat every day after school. I was in 8th grade and going through what felt like the worst year of my social life. I'd had a falling out with my friend group over something stupid, and suddenly I was eating lunch alone and spending most of my free time trying to avoid the awkward hallway encounters that made middle school feel like a nightmare. My mum worked late most days, so I had about 2 hours to kill between when school ended and when I could go home to an empty house. I started going to the public library because it was quiet, and I could do homework without anyone bothering me. Plus, I'd always been a reader, and the library felt like a safe space where being alone didn't seem weird or pathetic. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, was this soft-spoken woman, probably in her 50s, who seemed to know every book in the building. She'd helped me find things for school projects before, and she always remembered what I was reading and would suggest new books I might like. She had this gentle way of talking that made you feel like your interests mattered. For the first few weeks, I'd just find whatever empty table was available and spread out my homework. Sometimes all the tables would be full, and I'd end up trying to work in uncomfortable chairs or at computers that other people needed. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than sitting at home feeling sorry for myself. One day, when I arrived at my usual time, Mrs. Chen approached me with a smile and said she'd noticed I came in every day after school. She'd set aside a specific table in the quietest corner of the library and put a small reserved sign on it. She told me it would be my spot for as long as I needed it. I was surprised and a little embarrassed that she'd noticed my routine, but also grateful to have a designated place to sit. The table was perfect, tucked away from the busier areas but still near the fiction section, where I like to browse for new books. It felt like having my own little sanctuary in a public space. Mrs. Chen started checking on me occasionally, not in an intrusive way, but just to make sure I had everything I needed. She'd recommend books based on what she'd seen me reading, or quietly let me know when new releases came in that she thought I'd enjoy. She never asked about why I was spending so much time at the library, but I could tell she understood that I needed a safe place to be. As the weeks went by, that corner table became more than just a place to do homework. It was where I discovered authors who had become lifelong favourites, where I worked through the confusing emotions of being a teenager, and where I felt like I belonged, even when everything else felt chaotic. Mrs. Chen would sometimes sit with me for a few minutes when the library was quiet, asking about what I was reading or sharing stories about books she'd loved when she was my age. She had this way of making me feel like my thoughts about books were intelligent and worth discussing, even when I was just a lonely middle schooler killing time. By the spring, my social situation at school had improved, and I'd made some new friends, but I kept coming to the library anyway. That table and Mrs. Chen's quiet kindness had become such an important part of my day that I didn't want to give it up. Even when I had other places I could go, I chose to keep reading in my corner. When I moved up to high school the following year, I stopped by to thank Mrs. Chen for everything she'd done. She said watching me discover new books and seeing me grow more confident had been one of the highlights of her job. She told me she'd always be there if I needed a quiet place to read or just someone to talk to about books. I'm in college now, but whenever I'm home, I still visit that library. Mrs. Chen retired last year, but she'd told her replacement about me and my corner table. The new librarian mentioned that Mrs. Chen had spoken fondly about the quiet teenager who'd spent a year reading in that spot and how much she'd enjoyed our conversations about books. That reserved table became the foundation for my love of reading and my belief that libraries are sacred spaces where people can find what they need, whether that's information, entertainment, or just a safe place to exist. Mrs. Chen understood that sometimes what a person needs most is simply a place to belong without having to explain why they're there. Mrs. Chen's gift wasn't just about saving a seat. It was about recognizing when someone needed stability and quietly providing it. She created a sense of belonging for OP during one of those brutal middle school periods when everything feels uncertain. The fact that she never pried, but just offered consistent support, shows perfect instincts about how to help a struggling teenager. Here's a story about the power of presence during our most vulnerable moments. My friend stayed on the phone with me until I fell asleep. I was going through what felt like the worst panic attacks of my life. The kind that would hit me right before bed and leave me lying in the dark, convinced something terrible was going to happen. My anxiety had gotten so bad that I was afraid to fall asleep alone, because my mind would just spiral into worst-case scenarios. My friend Mia and I had been close since college, and she was one of the few people who really understood how debilitating anxiety could be. She dealt with her own mental health struggles and never made me feel like I was being dramatic or overreacting when I talked about how scared I felt during panic attacks. One night when the anxiety was particularly bad, I called Mia around 11 o'clock, crying and hyperventilating. I felt guilty for bothering her so late, but I was desperate and didn't know what else to do. I'd tried all the breathing exercises and grounding techniques, but nothing was working, and I was scared I wouldn't be able to calm down. Mia answered on the second ring and immediately could tell from my voice that I was having a panic attack. She didn't ask a lot of questions or try to give me advice. She just started talking in this calm, steady voice, telling me to breathe with her and focus on her words instead of the scary thoughts racing through my head. After about 20 minutes, the worst of the panic attack had passed, but I was still too wound up to sleep. I kept apologizing to Mia for keeping her awake and said I should probably let her go. That's when she said something I'll never forget. "Don't worry, I'll stay until you're calm. I'm not going anywhere." Mia started telling me random stories about her day, funny things that had happened at work, a movie she'd watched, just normal conversation that helped my brain focus on something other than anxiety. Her voice was so soothing and familiar that I could feel myself starting to relax for the first time in hours. As I got drowsier, Mia's voice got softer, and she started talking about peaceful things like her grandmother's garden or the sound of rain on windows. She seemed to instinctively know exactly what would help me feel safe and calm. She never rushed me or suggested I should try to sleep before I was ready. Eventually, I must have drifted off while she was still talking, because I woke up the next morning with my phone dead on the pillow next to me. When I charged it and called Mia back, she said she'd stayed on the line for about an hour after I fell asleep, just to make sure I was really okay before hanging up. I felt terrible that she'd lost sleep because of my anxiety, but Mia just laughed and said she was glad she could help. She told me she'd been in similar situations and knew how isolating it felt to be alone with panic attacks. She said talking someone through a crisis was just what friends did for each other. This became our routine for the next few weeks while I was going through a particularly rough patch. Whenever I felt a panic attack coming on at bedtime, I'd call Mia and she'd stay on the phone until I fell asleep. She never made me feel guilty about needing that support, and she never suggested I was calling too often. Eventually, I started therapy and got on medication that helped manage my anxiety better. I didn't need those late-night phone calls as much, but knowing Mia was there if I needed her made such a difference in my recovery. Just having that safety net gave me confidence to face the anxiety instead of being terrified of it. Years later, when Mia was going through her own difficult time with depression, I was able to return the favour by being there for her when she needed support. We'd learned from each other that sometimes the most helpful thing isn't advice or solutions, but just the presence of someone who cares about you and won't leave you alone in the dark. That story ends there. Mia understood that panic attacks aren't rational, and that sometimes the solution isn't fixing anything, just staying present until the storm passes. The way she adjusted her voice and topics as OP got sleepier shows incredible intuition about what actually helps during a crisis. That kind of patient, consistent support can be life-changing for someone struggling with anxiety. Moving on to a story about unexpected encouragement when we need it most. A stranger paid for my coffee and wished me good luck. I had a job interview that morning for a position I really wanted. My first potential job out of college. and I was incredibly nervous. I'd been unemployed for 3 months since graduation, living with my parents and feeling like a failure while watching my classmates start their careers. The interview was scheduled for 9 in the morning, and I'd gotten to the area about an hour early because I was paranoid about being late. I found a coffee shop near the office building and decided to sit there reviewing my notes and trying to calm my nerves. I ordered a simple coffee and found a quiet corner table where I could spread out my papers. I kept going over possible interview questions and second-guessing whether my outfit looked professional enough. Every few minutes, I'd check my phone for the time and feel my stomach twist with anxiety. This job felt like my last hope after so many rejections, and I was terrified I'd mess up the opportunity. Around 8:30, I realised I should probably head to the office building to find the right floor and check in early. When I went to pay for my coffee, the barista told me it had already been taken care of. I was confused and asked who had paid for it, looking around the coffee shop for someone I might know. The barista pointed to an older woman who was gathering her things to leave. She was probably in her 60s, dressed in a business suit, and she smiled when she saw me looking in her direction. She walked over to my table and said, "I couldn't help but notice you practicing for an interview. Good luck today." I was surprised and grateful, but also curious about how she'd known what I was doing. She laughed and said she'd been in HR for 30 years and could spot someone preparing for an interview from across the room. She said she remembered how nerve-wracking those early career interviews could be and wanted to wish me well. She introduced herself as Patricia and told me she'd been where I was starting out and feeling like everything depended on one interview. She said the nervousness was normal and actually showed I cared about the opportunity. Her calm confidence was exactly what I needed to hear in that moment. Patricia gave me one piece of advice that I still remember. She said to think of the interview as a conversation rather than a test, and to remember that they'd called me in because they already saw potential in my application. She said my job was just to show them who I really was, not to try to be someone else. When I thanked her for the coffee and the encouragement, she said she hoped I'd pay it forward someday by helping another nervous young person. She said she made it a habit to look for opportunities to encourage people who were taking important steps in their lives. The interview ended up going really well. I felt more confident and relaxed than I'd expected, partly because Patricia's words kept coming back to me. When they asked difficult questions, I remembered her advice about having a conversation rather than trying to give perfect answers, and it helped me be more authentic. I got the job. When they called to offer me the position, I immediately thought about Patricia and how her small act of kindness had helped set the tone for my entire day. Her coffee cost maybe $3, but her encouragement was worth so much more in that moment when I needed confidence. I've been working in that field for 5 years now, and I still remember Patricia whenever I see someone who looks nervous before a big opportunity. I've bought coffee for a few anxious-looking people myself, and I always try to offer the same kind of gentle encouragement she gave me. Last month I was in a coffee shop and saw a young woman reviewing what looked like interview notes. I bought her coffee and told her good luck, just like Patricia had done for me. She seemed as surprised and grateful as I'd been, and I realised I'd become part of the chain of kindness that Patricia had started with me. Patricia understood that sometimes what we need isn't advice or reassurance, but just acknowledgement that someone believes in us. Her willingness to approach a stranger and offer encouragement shows the kind of generosity that costs almost nothing but can change someone's entire day. The fact that she made this a regular practice makes it even more meaningful. Let's move to a story about unconditional love and the healing power of animal companionship. My dog comforted me during every panic attack. I adopted Max from a shelter when he was about 2 years old, just a few months after I'd started having regular panic attacks. I wasn't specifically looking for an emotional support animal, but I'd heard that having a pet might help with the loneliness and anxiety I was struggling with after a difficult breakup. Max was this medium-sized mixed breed with the gentlest brown eyes I'd ever seen. The shelter staff said he'd been returned twice by previous owners who complained he was too clingy and always wanted to be touching someone. What they saw as a flaw was exactly what I needed, a companion who wouldn't leave me alone during the hardest time of my life. The first few weeks with Max were an adjustment for both of us. He followed me everywhere and seemed nervous when I left for work, probably worried he'd be abandoned again. I was dealing with my own anxiety about having a pet for the first time, but there was something comforting about having another living being in the apartment who was happy to see me every day. The first time Max witnessed one of my panic attacks, I wasn't sure how he'd react. I was sitting on my couch when the familiar wave of terror washed over me, my heart racing and my breathing becoming shallow. I was trying to do my grounding exercises when I felt Max jump up onto the couch next to me. Without any training or prompting, Max positioned himself so his body was pressed against my chest and stomach. The weight of him was immediately calming, like a living weighted blanket that helped slow my racing heart. He stayed perfectly still, just breathing steadily, while I focused on the rhythm of his chest rising and falling. What amazed me was how Max seemed to sense when a panic attack was coming, before I even recognized it myself. He'd start following me more closely, nudging my hand with his nose, or positioning himself near me in ways that made it easy for him to provide comfort when I needed it. It was like he could read changes in my breathing or body language. During the worst attacks, when I felt like I couldn't breathe and was convinced something terrible was going to happen, Max would curl up on my chest until my breathing slowed down. The pressure of his warm body somehow convinced my nervous system that I was safe, that I could focus on his calm presence instead of the panic. Max never seemed scared or confused by my panic attacks. He'd just calmly do his job, staying with me until the worst had passed and I was breathing normally again. Then he'd give me gentle kisses and settle in next to me for as long as I needed him there. It was like he understood his role as my emotional anchor. Over time, the panic attacks became less frequent, partly because I felt more secure knowing Max was there to help me through them. Instead of being terrified when I felt anxiety building, I'd look for Max and know that even if a full panic attack hit, I wouldn't have to face it alone. Max seemed to take his role as my protector very seriously. During thunderstorms or fireworks, when loud noises would sometimes trigger my anxiety, he'd immediately come find me and assume his position against my chest. He'd stay there until the sound stopped and he was sure I was okay. The most incredible thing was how Max could tell the difference between regular sadness or stress and actual panic attacks. If I was just having a bad day or feeling worried about something, he'd offer normal dog comfort, sitting near me or bringing me his favourite toy. But during panic attacks, he'd switch into this focused, therapeutic mode that was completely different. Friends and family were amazed by Max's instincts. My mum, who'd been worried about my panic attacks, felt so much better knowing Max was watching over me. She said it was like I had a furry therapist who never took breaks and never judged me for having anxiety. Max and I have been together for 4 years now, and while my panic attacks are much better controlled, he still watches over me carefully. He's older and calmer now, but he still has that same intuitive understanding of when I need extra support. He'll rest his head on my lap during stressful phone calls, or position himself close to me when he senses I'm having a difficult day. I've learned so much about unconditional love from Max. He never made me feel broken or embarrassed about my anxiety. He just saw someone who needed help and consistently provided it. His simple presence taught me that healing doesn't always require complicated solutions. Sometimes it just requires someone who refuses to leave you alone in your darkest moments. That story ends there. Max's intuitive understanding of OP's needs shows how deeply animals can connect with human emotions. The fact that he could distinguish between regular stress and actual panic attacks reveals an incredible level of emotional intelligence. Sometimes the most effective therapy comes from a companion who loves you without conditions or judgment. Moving on to a story about preserving memories and celebrating family bonds. My sister made me a scrapbook of our childhood. I was getting ready to move across the country for a new job. my first time living more than a few hours away from my family. Rachel and I are only 2 years apart and have always been close, but the thought of being separated by 3 time zones was emotional for both of us. The weeks leading up to my move were hectic with packing, paperwork, and trying to spend time with everyone before I left. Rachel had been quieter than usual, and I could tell she was sad about me leaving, even though she was trying to be supportive about my career opportunity. The night before my flight, Rachel knocked on my bedroom door, holding a large wrapped package. She seemed nervous and said she'd been working on something for weeks, but wasn't sure if it was silly. She handed me the gift and said she wanted me to have something to remember home by. When I unwrapped it, I found this beautiful leather-bound scrapbook with Sisters Forever, embossed on the cover in gold lettering. Inside were hundreds of photos from our childhood that I hadn't seen in years, along with handwritten captions and memories that Rachel had carefully arranged on each page. The first section was our early childhood photos, starting with pictures of us as babies and toddlers. Rachel had found photos I'd completely forgotten about, like us building blanket forts in the living room, or dressed up for Halloween when we were maybe 4 and 6 years old. She'd written little stories next to each photo, explaining what she remembered about those moments. There were pages dedicated to family vacations, birthday parties, school events, and just random moments that had somehow been captured on film. Rachel had organised everything chronologically, so I could see how we'd grown up together, but she'd also included themed sections like sister adventures and matching outfits Mom made us wear. What made the scrapbook even more special were the little notes Rachel had written throughout. Next to a photo of us at Christmas morning, she'd written about how I always let her open her presents first because I liked watching her get excited. Next to a picture of us at the beach, she'd described how I'd helped her overcome her fear of waves. Rachel had included things beyond just photos too. There were ticket stubs from movies we'd seen together, programs from school plays we'd both been in, even some of the silly notes we used to leave for each other when we were teenagers. She'd saved mementos I didn't even remember existed. The last section of the scrapbook was dedicated to more recent photos from our adult years. Pictures from college graduations, family gatherings, vacations we'd taken together as grown-ups. These pages reminded me that our sisterhood hadn't ended with childhood. It had just evolved into something deeper and more meaningful. On the very last page, Rachel had written a long letter about what our relationship meant to her. She talked about how I'd always been her protector and role model, how I'd helped her through difficult times, and how proud she was of the woman I'd become. She said she wanted me to have something to look back on when I moved out. I was crying by the time I finished looking through the whole scrapbook. Rachel had put so much thought and work into preserving our shared memories, and seeing our entire childhood laid out like that made me realise how lucky I'd been to grow up with such a wonderful sister. Rachel said she'd started working on it as soon as I told her about the job offer. She'd gone through boxes of old photos at our parents' house, called relatives to track down pictures she remembered, and even reached out to childhood friends who might have photos of us together. The most touching part was learning that Rachel had enlisted our mum's help with some of the memory details. She'd wanted to make sure she got the stories right, especially for photos from when we were too young to remember clearly. Our mum had helped fill in context about family trips and special occasions that had been captured in pictures. I took the scrapbook with me when I moved, and it became one of my most treasured possessions in my new apartment. Whenever I felt homesick or lonely, I'd flip through those pages and remember all the love and laughter that had shaped my childhood. It was like having a piece of home with me wherever I went. 2 years later, when Rachel got engaged, I made her a similar scrapbook focused on her relationship with her fiancé. I wanted her to have the same kind of thoughtful gift she'd given me. She cried when I gave it to her and said creating my scrapbook had taught her how powerful it could be to preserve memories in such a personal way. That story ends there. Rachel's scrapbook was more than just a collection of photos. It was a love letter to their sisterhood and a recognition that OP would need those memories to feel connected to home. The effort she put into tracking down forgotten photos and getting the stories right shows how much she understood the value of preserving family history. Sometimes, the most meaningful gifts aren't expensive. They're just deeply personal. Let's move to our next story about educators who go beyond their job descriptions to care for their students. My teacher bought extra lunches for hungry students. Mr. Carter taught 7th grade social studies at my middle school, and he was the kind of teacher everyone respected, even if his class wasn't your favourite subject. He was strict about assignments and classroom behaviour, but he also had this way of making you feel like he genuinely cared about each student as a person, not just as someone to teach history to. I qualified for free lunch at school, which was sometimes embarrassing but necessary because my mum was raising 3 kids on her own. The cafeteria food wasn't great, but it was often the most substantial meal I'd get during the day. Some days, when money was really tight at home, school lunch was pretty much all I could count on eating until dinner. About halfway through the school year, I started noticing something interesting about Mr. Carter's classroom routine. He'd always eat lunch at his desk while grading papers or preparing for afternoon classes, but he'd also have extra sandwiches or fruit that he'd casually offer to students who stopped by his room during lunch period. At first I thought he was just sharing food he'd packed but couldn't finish. Mr. Carter was a pretty big guy, so it seemed reasonable that he'd bring more food than he needed. But then I started paying attention to which students he'd offer these extra meals to, and I realised they were always kids like me who might not have much food at home. There was Jake, whose dad had lost his job and whose family was staying with relatives while they looked for a new apartment. There was Maria, who lived with her elderly grandmother who was on a fixed income. There was David, whose mum worked 2 jobs and often forgot to leave lunch money. Mr. Carter somehow knew which students needed extra food without making it obvious or embarrassing. One day, when I was helping Mr. Carter organise supplies after school, I saw grocery receipts on his desk for sandwich ingredients, granola bars, and fruit. It hit me that he wasn't just sharing his own lunch, he was deliberately buying extra food to make sure certain students had enough to eat. He was spending his own money to feed kids who were hungry. I asked him about it directly, and Mr. Carter got a little embarrassed. He said he'd grown up in a family that sometimes struggled with food insecurity, and he remembered what it felt like to be hungry at school. He said teachers were supposed to help students learn, but it was hard to focus on learning when you were worried about when you'd eat next. Mr. Carter explained that he'd started bringing extra food after noticing that some students seemed listless during afternoon classes or would ask to visit the nurse around lunchtime. He said he'd rather spend some of his own money on snacks than watch students struggle through the day because they were hungry. He made me promise not to tell other students about his lunch program because he didn't want kids to feel like they were receiving charity. He said he'd just continue quietly offering food to students who seemed like they might need it, and anyone who was hungry was welcome to stop by his classroom during lunch. I kept Mr. Carter's secret, but I also started paying more attention to how he looked out for students in other ways. He'd let kids stay in his classroom during lunch if they didn't have friends to sit with. He'd offer to help with homework during his planning period if students were struggling. He'd even give rides home to students who missed their bus. Word got around among students that Mr. Carter's room was a safe place during lunch, even though nobody talked explicitly about the food situation. Kids who were dealing with bullying, family problems, or just felt lonely knew they could spend lunch period in his classroom and feel welcomed and supported. By the end of the year, Mr. Carter had probably fed dozens of students and helped countless others in ways that went far beyond teaching social studies. He'd created this informal support network where kids knew they could find help if they needed it, whether that was food, academic support, or just a place to belong during the school day. I graduated from that middle school 15 years ago, but I still remember Mr. Carter's kindness. He taught me that caring for others doesn't require grand gestures or official programs. Sometimes it just means paying attention to who might be struggling and quietly offering help. He showed me what it looks like when adults take responsibility for children's well-being beyond just their official duties. That story ends there, Mr. Carter understood that learning requires basic needs to be met first, and he took personal responsibility for making sure his students weren't distracted by hunger. The way he protected students' dignity by keeping his food program discreet showed how sometimes what children really need isn't grand programs or official assistance, but just an adult who notices they're struggling and quietly helps without making them feel ashamed about it. Here's a story about how honesty can unexpectedly restore our faith in humanity. A stranger returned my lost phone with all the cash still inside. I was having one of those days where everything seemed to go wrong. I'd been Christmas shopping at the mall, juggling multiple bags and trying to keep track of gifts for everyone on my list. Somewhere between the department store and the food court, my phone slipped out of my jacket pocket without me noticing. I didn't realize it was missing until I got home and went to check my messages. That sinking feeling in your stomach when you realize something important is gone hit me immediately. Not only was my phone expensive to replace, but I'd had about $80 in cash tucked behind my phone case for emergency situations. I drove back to the mall and retraced my steps, checking with security and asking at every store I'd visited. The security guard was sympathetic, but said phones rarely got returned once they disappeared in such a busy place. I left my contact information just in case, but I'd pretty much resigned myself to the loss. 2 days later, I got a call on my landline from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Marcus and said he'd found my phone in the mall parking lot. He'd apparently spent time figuring out how to contact me since the phone was locked, finally calling numbers from my emergency contact list until he reached someone who knew how to get in touch with me. When we met up so he could return my phone, I was prepared to find it damaged or to discover that the cash was missing. Instead, Marcus handed me my phone in perfect condition, and when I checked the case, all $80 was still there. He'd even bought a protective case to keep it safe while he was trying to find me. I was so grateful that I tried to give Marcus some of the cash as a reward, but he absolutely refused to take anything. He said he'd lost his wallet once and remembered how stressful it had been, especially during the holidays when money was already tight. He said someone had returned his wallet with everything intact, and he wanted to pay that kindness forward. Marcus told me he'd actually been carrying my phone around for 2 days, calling people from my contact list whenever he had free time. He said he could have easily taken it to his cell phone provider and had it unlocked for his own use, but that never occurred to him as an option. He said returning lost items was just the right thing to do. When I asked Marcus why he'd gone to so much trouble, he said his grandmother had raised him to treat other people's property the way he'd want his own treated. He said she'd always told him that character was what you did when nobody was watching, and even though I'd never know if he'd taken the money, he would know. The whole experience reminded me that there are still genuinely honest people in the world who do the right thing simply because it's right, not because they expect recognition or reward. Marcus could have easily kept my phone, or at least taken the cash, and I never would have known who had found it. I tried to keep in touch with Marcus after that, wanting to somehow repay his kindness, but he seemed to prefer staying anonymous. He said knowing I got my phone back safely was satisfaction enough, and that if I really wanted to thank him, I should help someone else who lost something important. That story ends there. Marcus went above and beyond what most people would consider reasonable effort to return a lost phone, and his refusal to accept any reward shows genuine character. The fact that he'd been carrying it around for days, making phone calls to strangers just to do the right thing, is incredible. It's people like Marcus who prove that integrity isn't dead, it just doesn't always make headlines. Moving on to a story about the quiet ways our family members show love. My grandma always waited up until I got home safe. I lived with my grandmother during my last 2 years of high school after my parents moved across the country for my dad's job. I was 17 and didn't want to change schools during my senior year, so Grandma Rose offered to let me stay with her so I could graduate with my friends. Grandma was in her 70s then, and she'd been living alone since my grandfather passed away a few years earlier. She had her routines and her comfortable ways of doing things, and I was worried that having a teenager in the house would disrupt her peaceful life, but she insisted she'd love the company and that the house felt too quiet without family around. During my first few weeks living there, I tried to be as considerate as possible about her schedule. I'd come home right after school or work, help with dinner, and spend evenings doing homework at the kitchen table while she watched her shows. I didn't want to take advantage of her generosity by staying out late or causing her to worry about where I was. But Grandma noticed that I wasn't really living like a normal teenager. She sat me down one evening and told me that she didn't want me to feel like I had to be a perfect house guest. She said I should go to football games, hang out with friends, and do the things high school students were supposed to do. She said that's what she'd want for her own granddaughter. The first time I stayed out past 10 o'clock, I came home to find Grandma sitting in her favourite armchair in the living room, reading a book with the lamp on. She looked up when I walked in, smiled and said, "How was your evening, sweetheart?" I felt terrible that she'd stayed up waiting for me and apologised for being so late. Grandma just laughed and said she wasn't waiting up because she was worried or because she wanted to check up on me. She said she'd always waited up for my grandfather when he worked late shifts, and it had become such a habit that she couldn't fall asleep until she knew the people she loved were home safely. She said it was just something she did for family. This became our routine throughout high school. No matter what time I came home from games, dates, or hanging out with friends, there would be a light on in the living room, and Grandma would be there, reading or doing crossword puzzles. She'd always greet me warmly and ask about my evening, but never in a way that felt like interrogation. Sometimes I'd sit with her for a few minutes and tell her about my day or whatever had happened that evening. She was genuinely interested in my friends, my activities, and the typical teenage drama that probably seemed silly to someone her age. But she always listened like my problems and excitement were the most important things in the world. On nights when I was particularly late, I'd try to sneak in quietly so I wouldn't wake her, only to find her still sitting in that chair with her book. She'd look up with that same warm smile and say, "There you are." I was starting to get sleepy. It was her gentle way of letting me know she'd been waiting without making me feel guilty about it. The most touching part was realising that Grandma never went to bed until I was home, even when I told her I'd be very late. If I was at a party or out with friends until midnight or later, she'd still be there when I walked through the door. She never complained about losing sleep or suggested I should come home earlier. During my senior year, when I was staying out later more frequently with graduation parties and end-of-school activities, I started to understand what a sacrifice this was for her. Grandma was in her 70s and needed her rest, but she was consistently staying up hours past her normal bedtime just to make sure I got home okay. When I tried to tell her she didn't need to wait up for me, that I was old enough to get home safely on my own, she'd just smile and say, "The world feels less scary when someone's waiting for you to come home." "Auntie," she said, knowing someone cared enough to wait up was a gift she wanted to give me during what she knew was a difficult time being away from my parents. After graduation, when I moved away for college, Grandma admitted that those 2 years of waiting up for me had been some of her favourite times since Grandpa died. She said having someone to wait for had given her a sense of purpose and had made the house feel alive again. She said she missed hearing my key in the lock and knowing her family was safely home. I'm in my 30s now, with kids of my own, and I finally understand what Grandma meant about world feeling less scary when someone's waiting for you. There's something incredibly comforting about knowing that someone cares enough to lose sleep just to make sure you're okay. It's a form of love that doesn't require words or grand gestures, just presence and consistency. That story ends there. Grandma Rose's nightly vigil was such a pure expression of love and care. The fact that she'd stay up regardless of how late OP was out shows the depth of her commitment to making sure they felt safe and cared for. Her wisdom about the world feeling less scary when someone's waiting hits differently when you understand it as an adult. Let's move to a story about unexpected generosity. During a moment of need, a stranger gave me their umbrella in a downpour. I was walking back to my car after a doctor's appointment when the sky opened up with one of those sudden summer storms that drenches everything in about 30 seconds. I'd parked about 4 blocks away because the medical building's lot was full, and I was wearing a light cotton dress that was definitely not waterproof. The rain was coming down so hard that the sidewalks were turning into rivers, and everyone was running for cover under store awnings and building overhangs. I was trying to decide whether to wait it out or make a run for my car when I realised I was already soaked through and waiting wasn't going to help much. I started jogging toward where I'd parked, dodging puddles and trying to use my purse as some kind of makeshift protection from the rain. It was completely useless, and within a block I was dripping wet and feeling pretty miserable. My hair was plastered to my head and my dress was clinging to me in all the wrong ways. That's when I heard someone calling out behind me. I turned around and saw a woman about my age running up with a large black umbrella. She was completely dry and looked like she'd been prepared for the weather. Unlike me, she caught up and held the umbrella over both of us, immediately sheltering me from the worst of the downpour. She introduced herself as Sarah and asked where I was headed. When I told her I was trying to get to my car a few blocks away, she said she'd walk with me since we were going in the same direction. We started walking together under her umbrella, and for the first time in 10 minutes, I wasn't getting completely drenched. As we walked, Sarah and I chatted about the sudden storm and how neither of us had checked the weather that morning. She was cheerful and friendly, making light conversation that helped distract me from how uncomfortable I felt being so wet. She mentioned she always carried an umbrella because her grandmother had taught her to be prepared for anything. When we reached my car, I thanked Sarah profusely for sharing her umbrella and saving me from getting even more soaked. That's when she did something completely unexpected. She held out the umbrella and told me to keep it. She said she lived just around the corner and would be inside in a few minutes while I still had to drive home in wet clothes. I protested that I couldn't take her umbrella, especially since it was still pouring and she'd need it to get to her own destination. But Sarah insisted, saying she had other umbrellas at home and that I clearly needed this one more than she did. She said getting caught in the rain was miserable enough without having to sit in a wet car. Sarah helped me get into my car and handed me the umbrella through the window. She said she hoped the rest of my day went better and that everyone deserved a little help when they were having a rough time. Then she ran off toward her street, getting soaked in the few seconds it took her to reach her building. I sat in my car for a minute, holding this stranger's umbrella and feeling overwhelmed by her kindness. She'd not only shared her protection from the storm, she'd given it to me entirely, accepting that she'd get wet so I could stay dry during my drive home. It was such a simple gesture, but it completely changed my mood. I kept that umbrella in my car for months, and every time I saw it, I thought about Sarah's generosity. When I finally had a chance to help someone else who was caught in the rain without an umbrella, I knew exactly what to do. I gave them Sarah's umbrella and told them to pass it along when they had the chance. The umbrella has probably helped dozens of people by now, creating this chain of kindness that started with Sarah's split-second decision to help a stranger. Every time I see someone struggling in bad weather, I remember how much her simple act of sharing meant to me when I was having a miserable day. That story ends there. Sarah's willingness to give away her umbrella and get soaked herself shows the kind of selfless thinking that makes the world better. The fact that she made it seem like no big deal while literally sacrificing her own comfort for a stranger is beautiful. Sometimes the most meaningful gifts are the ones we give up when someone else needs them more. Moving on to a story about friendship and the healing power of just being present. My best friend brought me ice cream after my breakup. I'd been dating Jake for almost 2 years when he decided he needed space to figure himself out. It was one of those breakups where you know it's probably for the best, but it still feels like someone has ripped your heart out and stomped on it. I spent the first day crying and feeling sorry for myself in my apartment. My best friend Chloe had been checking on me through texts, but I'd been giving her short responses because I wasn't ready to talk about everything yet. I was in that stage of grief where you just want to wallow alone and eat junk food while watching sad movies. I told her I needed some time to process and would call when I was ready. Around 8 o'clock that evening, there was a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone and almost didn't answer because I looked terrible and didn't want to deal with people. But the knocking persisted, so I dragged myself off the couch and looked through the peephole. Chloe was standing there holding a grocery bag and wearing a sympathetic smile. When I opened the door, she held up the bag and said, "I brought supplies." Inside were 3 different flavours of premium ice cream, chocolate sauce, whipped cream, and those little maraschino cherries that make everything feel fancy. She'd basically brought me a complete ice cream sundae kit, which was exactly what my broken heart needed. Chloe didn't ask a lot of questions about the breakup or try to analyse what had gone wrong with Jake. She just set up the ice cream supplies on my coffee table, handed me the biggest spoon she could find, and settled in next to me on the couch. She said we could talk about it when I was ready, or we could just eat ice cream and watch terrible television. We ended up doing both. I cried while eating chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream, straight from the container, and Chloe just sat there, letting me process all my feelings without trying to fix anything. She'd occasionally hand me tissues or make funny comments about whatever show we were watching, but mostly she just provided calm, supportive presence. What meant the most was that Chloe didn't try to rush me through my sadness or immediately start talking about how I'd be better off without Jake. She seemed to understand that sometimes people need to feel their feelings fully before they're ready to move forward. She was just there to make sure I didn't feel alone while I was hurting. We spent the entire evening on my couch, working our way through all 3 flavours of ice cream, while I alternated between crying about the breakup and laughing at ridiculous reality TV shows. Chloe stayed until almost midnight, only leaving when I assured her I was feeling better and would be okay for the night. The next morning, Chloe texted to check on me and offered to bring coffee and breakfast if I wanted company. She didn't push when I said I needed another quiet day, but she made it clear that she was available whenever I was ready for more social interaction. She gave me space while making sure I knew I wasn't abandoned. Over the next few weeks, as I worked through the various stages of getting over Jake, Chloe was consistently supportive without being overwhelming. She'd invite me to do normal activities when I seemed ready for distractions, but she never made me feel guilty for having sad days or needing to talk through the same issues multiple times. Looking back, I realised that what helped me heal wasn't advice or attempts to make me see the bright side. It was having someone who cared enough to show up with ice cream when I was at my lowest point and just sit with me in my sadness. Chloe understood that sometimes the best thing you can do for a heartbroken friend is simply be present. I've tried to be that kind of friend for other people going through difficult times. When my co-worker went through her divorce, I brought her ice cream and tissues. When my sister was struggling with job loss, I showed up with her favourite takeout and let her vent. I learned from Chloe that presence is often more powerful than solutions. That story ends there. Chloe's approach to supporting OP was perfect because she didn't try to minimise the pain or rush the healing process. Sometimes the most helpful thing isn't fixing someone's problems, it's just making sure they don't have to face their worst moments alone. Ice cream and unconditional presence can be surprisingly therapeutic. Let's move to a story about how small daily gestures can become the bright spot in someone's routine. The old man at the park always brought treats for my dog. I adopted Luna from a shelter about 3 years ago, and part of our daily routine became afternoon walks to the neighbourhood park. It's a nice little space with walking paths, benches, and an area where dogs can run around off-leash. Luna loved exploring all the different smells and meeting other dogs who came through. There was this elderly man who was always there around the same time we'd arrive, usually sitting on the same bench with a newspaper and a coffee cup. He looked to be in his 80s, always dressed neatly in slacks and a cardigan, and he'd smile and nod when we walked past. Luna was naturally friendly and would sometimes wander over to say hello when she was off her leash. The first time Luna approached him, I called her back because I wasn't sure if he was comfortable with dogs. But he waved me off and said it was fine. that he enjoyed the company. He introduced himself as Mr. Bennet and mentioned that he'd had dogs most of his life, but couldn't have one anymore because of his living situation. He seemed genuinely happy to pet Luna and talk to her in that gentle voice people use with animals they love. After a few weeks of these casual interactions, Mr. Bennet started bringing dog treats with him to the park. Nothing fancy, just basic biscuits that he'd pull out of his jacket pockets when Luna came over to visit. He'd ask permission before giving her anything, and he was always careful about not overfeeding her or interfering with her training. Luna quickly learned to recognize Mr. Bennet and would make a beeline for his bench whenever we arrived at the park. He'd always have a treat ready and would spend a few minutes scratching behind her ears and telling her what a good dog she was. It became clear that these interactions were as much a highlight of his day as they were for Luna. Mr. Bennet told me he'd been coming to the park every day for years, ever since his wife passed away, and he'd moved into a senior living facility that didn't allow pets. He said watching the dogs play reminded him of the German shepherds he and his wife had raised throughout their marriage. He missed having an animal to care for and love. Our afternoon visits became a routine that all three of us looked forward to. Mr. Bennet would update me on things happening in the neighbourhood, and I'd tell him about Luna's latest adventures or training progress. He remembered details about her personality and would ask specific questions about how she was doing, like a concerned grandparent checking on a beloved grandchild. What touched me most was how Mr. Bennet always came prepared with treats, even on days when the weather was questionable or he wasn't feeling well. He'd mentioned having arthritis that made walking difficult some days, but he'd still make the effort to get to the park because he knew Luna would be looking for him. One day when Mr. Bennet didn't show up at his usual time, I was surprised by how disappointed both Luna and I felt. We'd gotten so used to his presence that the park felt different without him there. Luna kept looking toward his empty bench, clearly expecting him to appear with her daily treat. When Mr. Bennet returned a few days later, he apologised for missing our visits and explained that he'd been dealing with a minor health issue. He'd been worried that Luna would think he'd abandoned her and had asked his son to drive him to the park, even though he wasn't feeling great. He said he didn't want to break their tradition without explanation. Mr. Bennet continued meeting us at the park for about 2 years, until his health declined to the point where he couldn't make the daily walk anymore. Before he stopped coming, he gave me a large bag of Luna's favourite treats and asked me to tell her they were from him. He said getting to know Luna had been one of the best parts of his retirement. I still take Luna to that park, and we always pause at Mr. Bennet's bench. Sometimes I give her one of the treats he left, and I tell her it's from her old friend who loved her very much. It's my way of honouring the friendship they shared and remembering how much joy their simple, daily interaction brought to all of us. That story ends there. Mr. Bennet's commitment to showing up every day with treats shows how much Luna's friendship meant to him during a lonely time in his life. Their routine gave him purpose and connection when he was missing the companionship of having his own pets. Sometimes the most meaningful relationships happen between the most unexpected pairs. Here's a story about strangers stepping up when we're struggling with everyday challenges. A stranger helped me carry my groceries to the 3rd floor. I live in an old apartment building without an elevator, and my unit is on the 3rd floor. Usually, this isn't a big deal, but I'd just had surgery on my shoulder and was dealing with limited mobility in my left arm. Simple tasks that I normally wouldn't think twice about had become genuinely challenging. I'd put off grocery shopping for as long as possible because I knew it would be difficult to carry everything upstairs, but I was finally out of the basics and needed to make a trip to the store. I tried to be strategic about it, buying only the essentials and choosing items that weren't too heavy or bulky. Even with my careful planning, I ended up with more bags than I could realistically manage with one functional arm. The checkout person offered to help me load everything into my car, which was nice, but I was dreading the struggle of getting everything up to my apartment once I got home. When I pulled up to my building, I sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to figure logistics out. I could probably make multiple, but that trips would mean leaving groceries unattended in the hallway, which didn't seem safe. I was considering asking a neighbour for help when I saw a young man walking toward the building. He looked to be in his 20s, tall and fit, and I recognised him as someone who lived in the building, though we'd never actually met. I normally would have been too proud or embarrassed to ask for help from a stranger, but my shoulder was throbbing, and I was feeling pretty desperate about the grocery situation. I called out to him as he was about to enter the building and explained my situation. I told him about my surgery and asked if he might be able to help me carry a few bags upstairs. I was prepared to offer to pay him for his time because I knew it was an inconvenience for someone I didn't really know. The guy, who introduced himself as Noah, immediately said, of course he'd help, and refused to let me carry anything myself. He loaded his arms with grocery bags and told me to just focus on getting upstairs safely without straining my shoulder. He was genuinely concerned about me overexerting myself and insisted on handling all the heavy lifting. As we walked up the stairs, Noah mentioned that he'd had shoulder surgery himself a few years back and remembered how frustrating it was when simple tasks became impossible. He said he'd been in situations where he needed help and was grateful when people stepped up, so he was happy to return the favour for someone else. Noah carried all my groceries up 3 flights of stairs without complaint, even though some of the bags were awkward and heavy. When we reached my door, he waited while I unlocked it and then brought everything inside to my kitchen. He asked if there was anything else I needed help with, like putting items away on high shelves. I thanked Noah repeatedly and tried to give him money for helping, but he absolutely refused to accept anything. He said he was glad he'd been there at the right time and that helping neighbours was just part of living in a community. He told me not to hesitate to ask if I needed assistance with anything else while I was recovering. Before he left, Noah gave me his phone number and said to text him if I needed help with groceries or other errands over the next few weeks. He said he worked from home most days and could usually make time to help out. It was such a generous offer from someone who barely knew me. I ended up taking Noah up on his offer a few times during my recovery. He'd help me carry laundry to the basement or bring heavy items upstairs when I couldn't manage them myself. He never acted like it was a burden and always seemed genuinely happy to help out a neighbour who was struggling. Noah's kindness during those weeks taught me a lot about community and looking out for each other. When I was fully recovered, I made sure to pay attention to other neighbours who might need assistance. I've helped elderly residents with their groceries and offered to carry things upstairs for people who seem to be struggling. That story ends there. Noah's immediate willingness to help and his refusal to accept payment shows the kind of neighbour everyone hopes to have. The fact that he'd been through similar challenges himself made his assistance feel genuinely empathetic rather than just polite. Sometimes community is built on grocery. Let's move bag at a time. Moving on to a story about educators who recognise potential and change lives through encouragement. My teacher gave me a book that changed my life. I was struggling through my junior year of high school, not because the work was too hard, but because I felt disconnected from everything we were studying. Most of my classes felt like exercises in memorization rather than learning, and I was going through the motions without really caring about any of it. Ms. Taylor taught AP English Literature, and even though I wasn't in her advanced class, she'd noticed me in the hallways and knew I spent a lot of time reading during lunch periods. I was always carrying a book, usually science fiction or fantasy novels, that helped me escape from the stress and boredom of school life. One day after regular English class, Ms. Taylor stopped me in the hallway and asked what I was currently reading. I showed her the paperback I had with me, expecting her to make some comment about how I should focus more on classic literature instead of genre fiction like most teachers did. Instead, Ms. Taylor surprised me by saying she'd read that author too and asking what I thought about the themes in the story. We ended up having this amazing 10-minute conversation about science fiction as social commentary, and I realised she actually understood why I was drawn to those kinds of books. The next day, Ms. Taylor found me during lunch period and handed me a worn paperback copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. She said she thought I'd connect with it in ways that might surprise me, and that she'd love to hear what I thought after I'd read it. She emphasised that this wasn't an assignment, just a recommendation from one reader to another. I was hesitant at first because I'd heard other students complain about having to read Harper Lee's novel for class assignments. It had a reputation for being one of those books that teachers forced students to analyse to death. But Ms. Taylor had presented it as a personal suggestion rather than schoolwork, so I decided to give it a chance. Reading To Kill a Mockingbird outside the pressure of classroom discussions and essay assignments was completely different than I'd expected. The story grabbed me immediately, and I found myself staying up late because I couldn't put it down. Scout's perspective on justice and morality resonated with questions I'd been thinking about but couldn't articulate. When I finished the book, I sought out Miss Taylor to talk about it. She didn't quiz me on plot details or symbolic meanings like I'd expected. Instead, she asked how the story made me feel and what questions it had raised for me. We had this incredible conversation about empathy, courage, and standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Ms. Taylor told me she'd recommended that particular book because she'd noticed I seemed frustrated with the world around me, much like Scout felt frustrated with the injustices in her community. She said she thought I'd appreciate how Harper Lee used storytelling to explore complex moral issues without providing easy answers. That conversation opened up something in me that I hadn't realised was there. For the first time, I started thinking about literature as more than just entertainment or academic exercise. I began to see how books could be tools for understanding human nature and grappling with difficult questions about society and morality. Ms. Taylor continued to recommend books throughout the rest of high school, always choosing titles she thought would speak to whatever I seemed to be processing at the time. She'd lend me her personal copies and then make time to discuss them with me, treating me like an intellectual equal rather than just a student. Those conversations with Miss Taylor about books became the highlight of my high school experience. She helped me discover that I had thoughts and insights worth sharing, and that literature could be a way of exploring ideas that mattered to me. She made me feel like my perspective was valuable and intelligent. When I graduated, Ms. Taylor wrote me a letter saying she believed I had the mind of a scholar and hoped I'd continue reading and thinking critically about the world. She said watching me discover the power of literature had reminded her why she loved teaching and that she expected great things from me in the future. I majored in English literature in college, partly because of the foundation Ms. Taylor had built during our informal book discussions. I'm now a high school teacher myself, and I try to do for my students what she did for me. I look for kids who seem disconnected or frustrated, and I find books that might help them see themselves and their world more clearly. I still have that original copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that Ms. Taylor gave me, along with several other books she recommended over the years. Each one represents a moment when she saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, and gave me tools to develop it further. That story ends there. Ms. Taylor understood that sometimes the right book at the right moment can completely change a student's relationship with learning and thinking. Her approach of treating OP as an intellectual equal rather than just another student to manage made all the difference. The ripple effect of that one book recommendation is still continuing through OP's own teaching career. Let's move to a story about family pride and the power of showing up in meaningful ways. My brother surprised me at graduation with a banner. I was finishing my master's degree in social work, and while I was proud of the accomplishment, I wasn't planning a big celebration. Most of my family lived several states away, and graduate ceremonies tend to be pretty low-key affairs compared to undergraduate graduations. My brother Ethan lived about 6 hours away and had just started a new job, so I wasn't expecting him to make the trip for my graduation. We talked on the phone a few days before, and he'd congratulated me and said he wished he could be there, but couldn't get time off work on such short notice. The morning of graduation, I was getting ready in my apartment, feeling a mix of pride and anticlimax. I'd worked really hard for 2 years to complete my degree while working full-time, and reaching the finish line felt significant, even though the actual ceremony would probably be pretty boring. My phone rang around 10 in the morning, and it was my mum calling to wish me luck and tell me how proud she was. During our conversation, she mentioned that she wished the whole family could be there to celebrate with me. I assured her that I understood everyone had their own responsibilities and that knowing they were thinking of me was enough. I arrived at the graduation venue about an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to start. As I was walking toward the building in my cap and gown, I heard someone shouting my name from across the parking lot. I turned around and saw Ethan jogging toward me with a huge smile on his face. I was completely shocked to see him there and asked how he'd managed to get time off work and make the 6-hour drive. He said he'd lied about not being able to come because he wanted to surprise me, and that he'd driven down the night before and stayed in a hotel so he'd be fresh for the ceremony. But the real surprise was what Ethan was carrying. He had this enormous banner that he'd clearly made himself, with my name painted in big letters surrounded by decorations and congratulatory messages. It said, "We're proud of you," in bright colours, and looked like he'd spent hours working on it. Ethan explained that he'd wanted to make sure I knew how proud our entire family was, even though they couldn't all be there in person. He'd gotten messages from our parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles and cousins to include on the banner, so it represented congratulations from everyone who loved me. During the ceremony, Ethan sat in the front row holding up his homemade banner whenever they called my name or degree category. Other families noticed it and were smiling and pointing, clearly charmed by his enthusiastic display of support. It made me feel like I had the biggest cheering section in the room. After the ceremony, Ethan insisted on taking dozens of photos of me with the banner, saying he wanted to document the moment properly. He'd also brought a nice camera instead of just using his phone, because he said this was too important for casual pictures. When I asked Ethan why he'd gone to so much trouble, he said he remembered how hard I'd worked throughout graduate school and how stressed I'd been trying to balance everything. He said reaching this goal deserved to be celebrated properly, and he'd wanted to make sure the day felt as special as the accomplishment was. The banner now hangs in my office at the social services agency where I work. Colleagues and clients often comment on it and ask about the story behind it. I love telling them about my brother who drove 6 hours and made a hand-painted sign just to make sure I knew how proud my family was. Ethan's surprise taught me something important about how we show up for the people we love. He could have just sent a card or made a phone call, but he understood that some moments deserve physical presence and tangible demonstrations of pride. His banner represented not just his own congratulations, but love from our entire extended family. I've tried to follow Ethan's example by making sure I'm present for important moments in other people's lives. When my friend defended her dissertation, I was there with flowers. When my cousin graduated from the police academy, I made the trip to cheer her on. Sometimes showing up is the greatest gift we can give. That story ends there. Ethan's decision to lie about his availability so he could surprise OP shows incredible thoughtfulness and planning. The homemade banner with messages from the whole family turned a potentially lonely graduation into a celebration filled with love. Sometimes the most meaningful gestures require both presence and creativity. Moving on to a story about unexpected celebration in ordinary moments. A stranger sang happy birthday to me in a cafe. I was spending my 28th birthday alone in a new city where I didn't know many people yet. I'd moved there for work about 3 months earlier and was still in that lonely phase of starting over where you haven't built real friendships yet, but you're trying to pretend everything's fine. I'd thought about flying home to celebrate with my family, but it was expensive, and I'd already used most of my vacation days for moving. My parents had called that morning to wish me happy birthday, and a few friends from my old city had sent texts, but the day felt pretty anticlimactic overall. Around lunchtime, I decided to treat myself to a nice meal at this cafe I'd been wanting to try. It was one of those places with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls, the kind of spot that felt cozy and welcoming even when you were eating alone. I brought a book and settled in at a table by the window. I ordered my food and was reading while I waited, trying not to think about how different this birthday was from previous years, when I'd always been surrounded by friends and family. I wasn't feeling sorry for myself exactly, but there was definitely a sense of melancholy about spending such a personal milestone in solitude. When the server brought my meal, I must have mentioned that it was my birthday as part of casual conversation. I probably said something about treating myself to a nice lunch or celebrating quietly. I wasn't fishing for attention, just making friendly small talk with someone who seemed genuinely interested in how my day was going. The server, whose name tag said Olivia, seemed genuinely pleased to learn it was my birthday. She asked if I had plans for later, and when I admitted I was probably just going to have a quiet evening at home, she said that didn't seem right for someone's birthday. She had this warm, maternal energy that made you feel like she actually cared about her customers' well-being. About 10 minutes after Olivia brought my food, she reappeared at my table carrying a small slice of chocolate cake with a single candle stuck in it. She set it down in front of me with a big smile and said she couldn't let me spend my birthday without cake, even if it was just a leftover piece from their dessert case. Then, to my complete surprise, Olivia started singing Happy Birthday right there in the middle of the cafe. Her voice was clear and confident, and she sang like she meant every word. Other customers started looking over, and instead of seeming annoyed by the interruption, several people began joining in with the song. Within seconds, this entire cafe full of strangers was singing Happy Birthday to me. People were smiling and clapping, and a few customers at nearby tables raised their coffee cups in a little toast when the song ended. It was like this spontaneous moment of community celebration that I never could have orchestrated myself. I was so moved by the whole experience that I started crying right there at my table. Not sad tears, but this overwhelming feeling of gratitude that strangers had taken time out of their day to acknowledge my birthday and make me feel special. It was exactly what I hadn't realised I needed. Olivia came back over after the impromptu performance and asked if I was okay. I told her that her kindness had completely changed my day and that I'd been feeling pretty lonely in this new city. She said she'd been in similar situations and knew how hard it could be to celebrate milestones when you're far from home. She explained that she'd moved to this city by herself several years earlier and remembered spending her first birthday here, feeling isolated and forgotten. She said a stranger had done something similar for her at a different restaurant, and she'd never forgotten how much that small gesture had meant during a difficult time. Before I left the cafe, Olivia made me promise that if I was ever feeling lonely in the city, I'd come back and visit. She said building community took time, but that people in the community meant everything during a difficult time. Building real connections with others makes all the difference when you're starting over somewhere new. Here's a story that shows how simple acts of protection can mean the world to someone who feels vulnerable. My friend walked miles to bring me medicine. I was living alone in a studio apartment about 2 miles from campus, and I'd come down with the worst flu of my life. I'm talking fever of 102, couldn't keep anything down, and so weak I could barely make it from my bed to the bathroom without feeling dizzy. It was a Tuesday night around 11 when the fever spiked, and I realised I didn't have any medicine in my apartment. No Tylenol, no throat lozenges, nothing that would help me feel even slightly human. I'd been sick for 3 days and had been too exhausted to think about restocking my medicine cabinet before everything got worse. I called my friend Jack, who lived in the dorms on the other side of campus. I felt terrible bothering him so late, but I was desperate and didn't know who else to call. My parents lived 6 hours away, and most of my other friends were dealing with their own midterm stress. When Jack answered, I could barely croak out what was wrong. I explained that I was really sick and asked if he might have any fever reducers I could borrow. I told him I'd pay him back and pick them up tomorrow when I felt better, but I was hoping he might be able to help me out. Jack immediately said he'd bring me whatever I needed, but I protested that it was too late and too far for him to walk. The campus shuttle stopped running at 10, and I knew he didn't have a car. I told him I'd figure something else out, maybe call a delivery service or just tough it out until morning. But Jack wouldn't hear of it. He said there was no way he was letting me suffer through the night when he could help. He told me to make a list of everything I needed from the pharmacy, and he'd walk over there and bring supplies back to my apartment. I felt guilty about him making such a long trip so late at night, but I was honestly too sick to argue much. I texted him a list of basics like Tylenol, throat spray, and some of those electrolyte packets. I also asked him to grab some soup if the store had any, since I hadn't been able to keep solid food down for days. Around midnight, there was a knock on my door. Jack was standing there with 2 pharmacy bags and a thermos of homemade soup that he'd apparently made in his dorm's kitchen before walking over. He looked windblown and tired from the long walk, but he was smiling and asking how I was feeling. Jack had bought everything on my list, plus a few extra things he thought might help. He'd gotten honey for my throat, ginger tea for my stomach, and even some of those instant oatmeal packets that would be easy to digest when I was ready for solid food again. He'd clearly thought carefully about what would be most useful for someone with the flu. He stayed for about 20 minutes, making sure I took medicine and had everything I needed within reach of my bed. Jack filled up water bottles for me, organised all the medications so I'd know when to take what, and even helped me set up a humidifier he'd borrowed from his roommate. When I tried to pay him back for all the supplies, Jack refused to take any money. He said he'd been really sick and alone before and remembered how awful it felt. He told me that having someone care enough to help made all the difference when you're feeling terrible and isolated. Jack checked on me every day for the rest of the week, texting to see if I needed anything else or just to make sure I was improving. When I was finally feeling better, I realised that his willingness to walk miles in the dark just to bring me medicine had been exactly what I needed to start recovering. The soup he'd made was incredible, and having real medicine instead of just suffering through made the whole experience so much more bearable. But more than the practical help, knowing that someone cared enough to make that effort when I was at my lowest point meant everything. That story ends there. Jack's decision to walk across campus at midnight shows the kind of friend everyone needs during tough times. The fact that he made homemade soup and thought to borrow a humidifier proves he understood that sometimes caring for someone means going above and beyond the basic request. Moving to a story about finding joy in unexpected places through the kindness of strangers. A stranger taught me how to dance at a wedding. I was at my cousin's wedding, sitting alone at a table watching everyone else have fun on the dance floor. I've always been self-conscious about dancing, convinced I look ridiculous when I try to move to music, so I usually just stay seated during the dancing portions of receptions, nursing a drink and people watching. The reception was in full swing and the DJ was playing all the classic wedding songs that get everyone excited. I could see my family members out there having a blast, but every time someone tried to pull me onto the floor, I'd make excuses about needing to finish my dinner or wanting to rest my feet. There was this woman at the table next to mine who I'd noticed throughout the evening. She looked to be in her 40s, was there with her husband, and seemed to be having the time of her life. She'd been dancing to almost every song, and it was clear she just genuinely loved music and moving to it. During a slow song, she came over to my table and sat down next to me. She introduced herself as Emma and asked if I was enjoying the wedding. We chatted for a few minutes about how beautiful the ceremony had been, and then she asked why I wasn't dancing with everyone else. I explained that I wasn't much of a dancer and preferred to watch other people have fun. Emma laughed and said she used to feel the same way until someone taught her that dancing wasn't about looking perfect. It was just about feeling the music and enjoying the moment. When the next upbeat song started, Emma stood up and held out her hand to me. She said she'd teach me a few simple moves and promised that no one would be watching because they'd all be too busy having their own fun. I was hesitant, but Something about her confidence and kindness made me want to try. Emma led me to a spot on the edge of the dance floor where we'd be less conspicuous. She started with really basic movements, just swaying to the beat and moving our arms in simple patterns. She kept saying things like, "Just feel the rhythm," and "Don't think so much, just move." What amazed me was how patient Emma was. When I stumbled or felt awkward, she'd just laugh and say it was all part of learning. She never made me feel stupid or clumsy, just encouraged me to keep trying and have fun with it. She had this way of making everything seem easy and natural. After about 10 minutes of basic moves, Emma started teaching me some actual dance steps. Nothing too complicated, just simple patterns that match the tempo of the music. She'd demonstrate first, then guide my movements, and gradually I started to feel more comfortable and confident. The breakthrough moment came when a song I really loved started playing. Emma could see that I connected with the music, and she encouraged me to just let go and dance however felt right. For the first time in years, I stopped worrying about how I looked and just enjoyed the feeling of moving to music I loved. We danced together for the next 3 songs, and Emma kept cheering me on and saying how much progress I was making. Other people started joining us, and instead of feeling self-conscious, I felt like I was part of the celebration instead of just watching from the sidelines. When the DJ finally played a slower song and we took a break, Emma told me she was proud of how brave I'd been. She said she could tell I'd been nervous about dancing, but that I'd been willing to try something new and had ended up having fun with it. Emma explained that she'd been a dance teacher for years before retiring, and she always got excited when she could help someone discover the joy of moving to music. She said some of her best memories were of teaching shy students who thought they couldn't dance and watching them realize they actually could. The rest of the reception was completely different for me. I spent most of the evening on the dance floor, trying out the moves Emma had taught me, and even improvising some of my own. I felt confident and happy in a way I'd never experienced at social events before. When it was time to leave, Emma hugged me goodbye and said she hoped I'd keep dancing. She told me that confidence was like a muscle that got stronger with practice, and that I should never let self-consciousness stop me from enjoying music and movement. That story ends there. Emma's patient teaching and genuine encouragement transformed what could have been another wallflower night into a breakthrough moment of confidence and joy. Sometimes the best gifts are the ones that help us discover abilities we never knew we had. Let's move to a story about how small gestures can become treasured traditions that connect us across distance. My grandma always sent me $1 in the mail, starting when I was about 7 years old. My grandmother began sending me $1 bill in the mail every month. It wasn't for my birthday or any special occasion, just a random Tuesday when I'd find an envelope with my name on it in careful cursive handwriting and my address written in her distinctive style. Inside would always be a crisp $1 bill and a short note written on her personal stationery. The notes were never long, maybe just a few sentences about what she was doing or asking about school or my activities. She'd always end with "Love, Grandma," and sometimes add a little drawing of a flower or smiley face. At first I thought the dollar was just a nice surprise from my grandmother, who lived 3 states away. I'd use the money to buy candy or save it up for something special I wanted. But as the months went by, I started to realize that these letters came like clockwork, always arriving during the 2nd week of every month without fail. My mum explained that Grandma had started this tradition because she wanted to stay connected to me, even though we couldn't see each other very often. She said Grandma missed having grandchildren nearby, and that sending the monthly $1 was her way of making sure I knew she was thinking about me regularly. The letters became something I looked forward to more than the money itself. Grandma would write about her garden, her friends at church, books she was reading, or funny things that had happened in her small town. She'd ask about my grades, my friends, whether I was being good for my parents, and what I wanted to be when I grew up. As I got older, the $1 stayed the same, but the conversations in her letters became more sophisticated. When I was in middle school, she'd ask about my classes and give advice about dealing with difficult teachers or mean kids. In high school, She'd write about college plans and remind me to work hard and stay focused on my goals. What struck me most was how Grandma remembered details from previous letters and would follow up on things I'd mentioned. If I'd told her about a big test, she'd ask how it went in her next letter. If I'd mentioned being nervous about something, she'd check to see if everything had worked out okay. The monthly dollar became a running joke in our family, but it was also something precious that connected me to my grandmother across the miles. Even when I was a teenager and $1 didn't buy much anymore, receiving those letters made me feel loved and remembered by someone who cared about the details of my life. During my senior year of high school, Grandma's letters started mentioning how proud she was that I was graduating and going to college. She said she'd been saving up some of my monthly dollars over the years and wanted to give me something special for graduation. I was touched but told her she didn't need to do anything extra. At my graduation party, my parents handed me a card from Grandma. Inside was $50 and a note explaining that she'd been setting aside some of my monthly dollars for years, adding her own money to it and saving it for this special milestone. She said she wanted to contribute to my college fund in her own small way. Grandma continued sending monthly dollars throughout college, even though I tried to tell her I didn't need them anymore. She said the money wasn't really the point. It was about maintaining our connection and making sure I knew someone was always thinking about me, especially when I was far from home. When Grandma passed away during my junior year of college, I realised I had dozens of her letters saved in a shoebox. I'd kept every single one because they'd become such a meaningful part of my life. Reading through them was like having a record of my entire childhood and adolescence told through her loving eyes. The last letter I received from Grandma came a few weeks after her funeral. My mum explained that Grandma had written several letters in advance and asked my grandfather to mail them after she was gone. The final note said she hoped I'd remember that someone had always believed in me and wanted the best for my future. That story ends there. Grandma's monthly tradition created a thread of connection that lasted for over a decade, proving that love doesn't require grand gestures when it's expressed consistently over time. The fact that she saved up some of those dollars for graduation shows how much thought went into what seemed like a simple gesture. Moving to a story that shows how neighbours can create support systems through simple acts of compassion. A neighbour left flowers on my doorstep after my loss. My husband died unexpectedly in a car accident last spring, and the weeks following his funeral were a blur of paperwork, condolence calls, and trying to figure out how to function in a world that suddenly felt completely different. Friends and family had been incredibly supportive, but eventually everyone had to return to their normal lives while I was still learning how to exist without him. About a month after the funeral, when the initial wave of support had died down and I was facing the reality of long-term grief, I started finding small bouquets of flowers on my front doorstep. Nothing elaborate or expensive, just simple arrangements of daisies or tulips or whatever was in season, wrapped in brown paper with a ribbon. At first I thought they might be from a neighbour who had forgotten to include a card, or maybe someone was delivering them to the wrong address. But they kept appearing every few days, always early in the morning before I left for work, and always placed carefully by my front door where I couldn't miss them. The flowers were clearly picked from someone's garden rather than purchased from a florist. They had that homegrown quality of stems cut at slightly different lengths and blooms in various stages of opening. Someone was taking time to select and arrange them thoughtfully, then walking over to leave them for me to find. After finding flowers for the third time, I started paying attention to see if I could figure out who was leaving them. I'd look out my window in the early morning, but I never caught anyone in the act. Whoever was doing this was being deliberately discreet about it, leaving the gifts without wanting credit or thanks. My neighbour Rachel lived 2 houses down, and she had the most beautiful flower garden on our street. I'd always admired her roses and peonies when I walked by, and I started to suspect she might be my anonymous flower deliverer. But when I tried to bring it up casually, she just smiled and said someone was being very kind. The flowers continued appearing for months through the difficult transition from spring into summer, when everything felt like it was moving forward, except my own life. On particularly hard days, finding those unexpected bouquets felt like receiving a hug from the universe, a reminder that someone was paying attention to my pain. What made the gesture even more meaningful was how the flowers seemed to match the seasons and my emotional state. During the worst weeks of grief, I'd find gentle white daisies that felt peaceful and comforting. When I started having better days, there might be bright yellow tulips that seemed more hopeful and cheerful. I never left a note or tried to directly acknowledge the flowers because it seemed like whoever was leaving them wanted to remain anonymous. Instead, I'd place them in vases around my house and let them brighten rooms that had felt dark and empty since my husband's death. One evening in late summer, I was working in my own small garden when Rachel walked over to chat. She mentioned that she'd been thinking about me and wondering how I was handling everything. During our conversation, she casually asked if the flowers had been helpful during such a difficult time. When I confirmed that they had meant the world to me, Rachel smiled and said she was glad. She explained that after her own mother died, someone had done something similar for her, and she'd never forgotten how much those small acts of kindness had helped her feel less alone during the worst of her grief. Rachel said she'd noticed that I seemed to be struggling and wanted to do something supportive, but she hadn't wanted to intrude on my privacy or add to my emotional burden by expecting thanks or conversation. She said leaving flowers felt like a way to show care without demanding anything in return. The flowers continued until fall, when Rachel's garden went dormant for the season. By then, I was doing better emotionally and had started building new routines that helped me cope with my loss. But I'll never forget how those simple bouquets had been a constant source of comfort during the darkest months. That story ends there. Rachel understood that sometimes the most helpful support doesn't require words or acknowledgement, just consistent reminders that someone cares. Her choice to remain anonymous until OP was ready for conversation shows perfect intuition about how to help someone who's grieving. Let's move to a story about how family can show up in exactly the way we need them most. My cousin drove 4 hours just to cheer me up. I was going through what felt like the worst few months of my adult life. I'd lost my job due to company layoffs, my long-term relationship had ended badly, and I was dealing with some health issues that required expensive medical treatment. I felt like everything was falling apart at once, and I was struggling to keep my head above water. I'd been trying to handle everything on my own because I didn't want to burden my family with my problems. When people asked how I was doing, I'd give vague answers about things being fine and try to change the subject. I was embarrassed about how much my life had derailed and didn't want to admit that I was barely keeping it together. My cousin Liam and I had always been close growing up, but we lived in different states now and usually only saw each other at family gatherings. We'd text occasionally and follow each other on social media, but we weren't in regular contact about day-to-day life. I figured he was busy with his own career and relationships. One Friday afternoon, I was having a particularly bad day and posted something vague on social media about feeling overwhelmed. I wasn't looking for attention or sympathy, just venting into the void because I didn't know what else to do with all the frustration and sadness I was carrying. About an hour later, my phone rang, and it was Liam calling. He said he'd seen my post and wanted to check on me because it seemed like I wasn't doing well. I tried to brush it off and say I was just having a stressful week, but Liam could tell from my voice that things were worse than I was admitting. Liam asked me directly what was going on, and something about his genuine concern made me break down and tell him everything. The job loss, the breakup, the medical bills, the way I felt like I was failing at being an adult. I cried on the phone while explaining how isolated and hopeless I'd been feeling. After listening to everything, Liam said he was worried about me being alone while dealing with so much stress. He asked if I had plans for the weekend, and when I said I was just going to stay home and probably feel sorry for myself, he said that wasn't going to happen. Liam told me he was driving over to see me and that we were going to spend the weekend doing things that would help me feel better. I protested that it was a 4-hour drive each way and he had his own life to worry about, but he said family was more important than whatever else he had planned. Saturday morning, Liam showed up at my door with a car full of supplies. He'd brought groceries for cooking meals, movies we used to watch when we were kids, board games, and even art supplies because he remembered I used to like drawing. He'd clearly thought carefully about what might cheer me up. Liam spent the entire weekend focused on helping me feel better. We cooked elaborate meals together, had long conversations about life and goals and disappointments, played games that made us laugh, and just enjoyed each other's company. He listened when I needed to vent and distracted me when I needed to stop thinking about my problems. What struck me most was how Liam approached the weekend. He didn't try to fix my problems or give me a lot of advice about what I should do differently. He just provided companionship and normalcy during a time when I'd been feeling completely alone and overwhelmed by everything going wrong. Sunday evening, when it was time for Liam to drive home, he made me promise to call him if I needed support or just wanted to talk. He said he wished he could stay longer, but that he'd be back to visit soon. He also left me with enough groceries and frozen meals to last for a week. The weekend had been exactly what I needed, even though I hadn't realised it before Liam showed up. Having someone care enough to drop everything and drive 4 hours just to spend time with me reminded me that I wasn't as alone as I'd been feeling. It gave me energy to start tackling my problems, instead of just feeling defeated by them. Over the following months, as I worked on getting my life back on track, Liam checked in regularly and offered encouragement. When I finally found a new job, he was one of the first people I called to share the good news. His weekend visit had been the turning point that helped me remember I was capable of handling difficult times. That story ends there. Liam's decision to drop his weekend plans and drive 4 hours shows what real family support looks like when someone is drowning. Sometimes the most helpful thing isn't solving someone's problems, but just making sure they don't face everything alone. If you made it through all these stories, consider subscribing, as I narrate stories just like these every evening for you. I hope they reminded you of something important that we sometimes forget in our daily rush. The world is full of people doing small, quiet acts of kindness that don't make headlines or go viral, but they change everything for the person receiving them. Thanks for listening in, and I will see you again soon. Take care.